Brandon Whitmore grabbed Michael Carter by the collar right there in front of the whole neighborhood and shoved him backward into the fence post. "Fight me, old man, or walk away and everybody here knows you're a coward." The crowd went silent. Michael didn't swing, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just looked at the boy, really looked at him with eyes that had seen things Brandon couldn't nightmare about. What happened next made grown men step back without knowing why. What city are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The morning. The Whitmore family moved in. Michael Carter was under the hood of a '98 Ford pickup that had been giving him grief for 2 weeks straight. Grease on his hands. Old Springsteen on the shop radio. Coffee going cold on the workbench. It was a Tuesday in late September, and Cedar Valley, Virginia smelled the way it always did that time of year. Cut grass and cooling air, and the faint wood smoke from somebody 3 streets over, getting their fireplace ready for fall. He heard the moving trucks before he saw them. 2 of them. Big ones. The kind with the shiny chrome logos on the side that meant somebody was paying extra just to feel important about relocating their furniture. He didn't look up right away. He just listened. The hydraulic groan of the lift gates, the clatter of hand trucks on the sidewalk, men calling back and forth to each other in the shorthand language of people moving heavy things on a schedule. Then he heard the voice. No, that goes in the east-facing bedroom. The east-facing one. How is that complicated?" Michael finally straightened up, wiped his hands on the shop rag hanging from his belt loop, looked over the fence line to the property next door, the old Calloway place that had been sitting empty for almost 8 months after Helen Calloway moved to be closer to her daughter in Raleigh. It was a big house. Good bones, his father would have said. The kind of place that deserved a family that would take care of it. The man standing in the driveway did not look like a man who took care of things. He looked like a man who hired other men to take care of things and then complained about how they did it. Richard Whitmore was maybe 55, broad-shouldered, but going soft in the middle, with the kind of tan that came from resort pools rather than outdoor work. He wore a polo shirt tucked into khakis, and he was pointing at one of the movers with the particular energy of someone who had never once been told no by anyone he paid. "Let's go, gentlemen. I'm not running a charity here. Move." Michael watched him for exactly 3 seconds, then went back under the hood of the truck. He'd met men like Richard Whitmore before. In boardrooms, in briefing rooms, in the back corridors of military installations where civilian contractors walked around with lanyards and clipboards, and the unearned confidence of men who'd never had to carry their mistakes home. He knew the type, the way he knew bad weather, not afraid of it, just aware it was coming. Sophie came out through the side door of the house at 8:14. The way she always did on school mornings, backpack over one shoulder, hair still slightly damp from the shower. Earbuds and head tilted down at her phone for the 17 seconds it took her to get to the end of the driveway where the bus would stop. She was 15. She had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's way of walking purposeful, like she always knew exactly where she was going, even when she didn't. She also had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh, and her mother's habit of leaving half-finished mugs of tea on every flat surface in the house. Ellen had been gone for 4 years. A brain aneurysm. Fast and without warning, and with the particular cruelty of something that gives you no time to prepare, no chance to say everything you should have said. One morning she was making breakfast and teasing Michael about his hair getting gray, and by afternoon she was gone, and the world was simply a different shape than it had been that morning. Michael didn't talk about it much, not because he was ashamed of grieving. He'd learned in the teams that grief was something you carried, not something you hid. But Sophie was 15, not 5. She remembered her mother. She had her own grief to carry. He didn't want to add the weight of his to hers. "Bus is coming," he said. She looked up from her phone, pulled one earbud out. "I know, Dad." "You eat something. Toast." "That's not a real answer. It's literally a piece of food." Hy gave her the look, not angry, just patient in the way that only fathers and combat veterans could sustain, and she rolled her eyes with the full-body commitment that only teenage girls could deploy. "I had toast and a banana," she said, "and some of your coffee, which I know you're going to make a whole thing about. You're 15. It was like half a cup." Half a cup of coffee is how you become a person who needs 3 cups of coffee. She almost smiled. He could see it at the corner of her mouth. Is that Navy SEAL wisdom? That's dad wisdom. Which is better? The bus rumbled around the corner, and she was already moving down the driveway, backpack bouncing earbud, going back in. Then she stopped, turned around. Those people moving in next door, she said, nodding toward the Calloway place. The son was looking at me. Michael kept his face neutral. What do you mean looking at you? Like looking. You know, in a way that felt weird. She shrugged, but there was something careful in the shrug, something practiced. I'm probably overthinking it. Did he say anything? No. The bus doors opened. I'm fine, Dad. Don't do the thing. What thing? The thing where you get very still and very quiet, and then later something happens. He almost smiled himself. I'll make chicken tonight. Text me if you're going anywhere after school. She was already on the bus. He watched it pull away, turned back toward the house next door. One of the movers was struggling with a large piece of furniture, looked like an oversized sectional sofa, the kind that required an engineering degree to get through a standard door frame. Standing by the open garage, watching the mover struggle without offering to help, was a young man, 19, maybe 20. Built like someone who spent significant time in a gym, but had never had to actually use his body for anything that mattered. He had the jawline and the haircut and the kind of relaxed arrogance that looked like confidence to people who didn't know the difference. He was watching the bus pull away. Michael noted this, filed it, said nothing. His name, Michael would learn over the following days, was Brandon Whitmore. And Brandon Whitmore had opinions about Cedar Valley. Specifically, he thought it was beneath him. The Whitmores had moved from Atlanta, where Richard had built a construction and real estate development company that had apparently made him very wealthy in a very short period of time. Brandon had grown up in private schools with private coaching in mixed martial arts and had won 3 regional amateur titles by the time he was 17. He wore those wins the way some men wore military service ribbons, like they entitled him to a level of deference that the world simply hadn't gotten around to recognizing yet. Cedar Valley was a town of about 12,000 people. It had a main street with a hardware store and a diner and a barbershop and a small branch library. It had a high school with a decent football team and a terrible basketball team and an excellent drama department that nobody gave enough credit to. The people who lived there had lived there a long time, or had come from somewhere else and decided to stop looking. They knew each other's names. They shoveled each other's driveways in winter. They brought casseroles when somebody died. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of people Brandon Whitmore had no idea what to do with. Michael watched the process of Brandon's introduction to the neighborhood the way he would have watched an intelligence assessment quietly from a distance, noting patterns. The first week, it was small things. Brandon parking his truck, a late-model Ram, with custom rims that cost more than some people's car payments, half on the sidewalk in front of the Rodriguez house, so that Maria Rodriguez had to walk her 3 kids through the yard to get to school. Michael saw this, said nothing. Helped Maria's youngest, a 6-year-old named Diego, step around a mud patch. The second week, it escalated. Brandon had started bringing friends over, guys from his old gym in Atlanta apparently, who drove up on weekends and seemed to have decided that Cedar Valley's quiet streets were an appropriate setting for late-night noise. Music thumping through the walls at midnight. Engines revving on the residential street. Laughter of the particular kind that doesn't care who it wakes up. Old George Perkins, who was 71 and had lived on this street for 40 years and slept lightly due to a back injury that had plagued him since a farming accident in 1987, knocked on the Whitmore door at 12:30 on a Friday night to ask politely if they might turn down the music. Michael was sitting on his back porch reading when he heard what happened next. "You come knock on my door at midnight, old man." Brandon's voice loud enough to carry. "You got a problem, you call the noise complaint line. Don't come to my house." A pause. George's voice muffled. "I don't care," Brandon said. "Go back to bed, Grandpa." The door closed. Michael set down his book. He sat with it for a moment. The old familiar pull, the current that moved under the stillness. The thing that had no good name, but that anyone who'd been in combat would recognize. It was not anger exactly. It was something colder and more deliberate. The part of him that evaluated situations and made decisions. He let it pass. He went inside, made sure the alarm was set, went to bed. But he didn't forget. The trouble with people like Brandon Whitmore. Michael had come to understand over a lifetime of watching human behavior in high-stakes environments was that they interpreted every absence of response as a victory. Every time someone didn't push back, didn't argue, didn't confront, didn't escalate, they read it as confirmation. They believed the world was structured the way their own experience told them it was structured, with the strong at the top, and everyone else too afraid to challenge them. It never occurred to them that the people who didn't push back might simply have chosen not to. Michael Carter had made choices every day for 23 years that Brandon Whitmore couldn't have imagined. He had chosen to hold his position in the dark, in places where the wrong sound meant everything. He had chosen which piece of information mattered and which was noise. He had chosen more than once between two terrible options and found a way to make the best choice from the options available. He had chosen after Ellen died to leave the life he'd been built for, the missions, the team, the particular clarity that came with operating at the edge of human capability, and come home. Not because he was afraid of it, because Sophie needed a father more than the Navy needed another operator. That was the choice people like Brandon would never understand. Power wasn't the ability to make others fear you. Power was the ability to choose. The third week, Brandon started focusing on Michael directly. It started with the vehicle. Michael drove a 2009 Jeep Cherokee with 180,000 miles on it. It had a dent in the rear quarter panel where a shopping cart had gotten away from someone in a Kroger parking lot, and the passenger side mirror had a crack in it from a road debris incident on the highway outside of Richmond 2 years ago. It was by any objective measure a well-used vehicle. Brandon found this hilarious. "Hey, Carter." The first time he used the name, and Michael noted that Brandon had learned his name, had done that much research, was over the fence line on a Wednesday afternoon. "That Jeep gonna make it to the end of the block?" Michael looked up from the garden bed he was working, looked at Brandon, said nothing. "I'm just saying," Brandon said, and the grin was the specific grin of someone who needed an audience, who was doing a performance. "I've seen better rides in the junkyard." "Okay," Michael said. "Just okay, nothing else." Went back to his garden. Brandon stared at him for a moment, visibly unsatisfied with this response, recalibrating, and then turned back toward his house. It happened a few more times over the following days. Comments about Michael's lawnmower, which was old but functional. Comments about his house, which needed a coat of paint on the shutters, and which Michael was getting to on his own schedule. Comments designed to needle, to provoke, to establish some kind of hierarchy that Brandon apparently needed established. Michael responded each time with the same controlled silence, and Brandon, as Michael had predicted, interpreted the silence as weakness. The Thursday that changed things started like any other. Sophie came home from school at 3:20. She dropped her backpack on the kitchen table, took an apple from the bowl on the counter, and was heading toward the stairs when Michael, who was going through paperwork at the table, said, "How was school?" "Good." "Anything interesting?" "Not really." She was already on the second step. "Sophie." She stopped. He knew her. He knew the particular way she carried her body when something was wrong, the slight forward tilt to the shoulders, the way she moved faster than she normally did, like she was trying to get somewhere that wasn't here before she had to talk about it. "Sit down a minute." "Dad." "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me," he said. "But sit down." She sat. The apple turned in her hands. She didn't look at him. "Brandon Whitmore was out front when I got off the bus," she said. Michael waited. "He was with some of his friends. I don't know them." She took a breath. "He said something." "What did he say?" Another breath. "He said he asked if I needed a ride somewhere. And when I said no, he said something about—" She stopped, started again. "He said I was too pretty to be walking around with such a boring dad. And his friends laughed. And then he said maybe I should call him sometime when I felt like having a better time." She looked up. Her jaw was set in the way Ellen's used to set when she was angry, but trying to stay composed. "I told him to leave me alone," she said. He said, okay, it was just a compliment. Why was I being... She paused. He used a word I don't want to say. Michael's hands were flat on the table. He was aware of them, aware of his own breathing, aware of the way the air in the kitchen had changed. Did he touch you? No. Did he follow you? No. I just walked inside and came home. Good. A beat. You did the right thing. Are you going to do something? She asked, and the question had a complicated layer to it. She was both hoping he would and hoping he wouldn't, both wanting protection and wanting normalcy, wanting a father and wanting a father who didn't scare people. I'm going to go next door, he said, and I'm going to have a conversation. Dad, I'm not going to do anything dramatic, he said, and he meant it. He meant it completely in the way that only someone who genuinely doesn't need to do anything dramatic can mean it. I'm going to talk to him, that's all. She looked at him for a long moment. He's bigger than he looks, she said. His friends say he's won like competitions and stuff. Michael nodded slowly. I know. So you're not worried? He looked at her. This girl with her mother's eyes, sitting at the table in the kitchen of the house he'd chosen over the life he'd been built for, and what he felt was not worry. It was something much quieter than that. I'll be back in 10 minutes, he said. Brandon was in the driveway with two of his friends when Michael walked over. The friends were the same type as Brandon, young gym-built, wearing expressions borrowed from action movies. One of them had a protein shake. They were all looking at something on somebody's phone. Brandon looked up when Michael opened the gate in the fence line between the properties. Something shifted in his face. Not fear, not yet, not even close. Something more like the specific pleasure of a person who likes conflict and has just seen conflict arriving on schedule. Carter, he said, what can I do for you? Michael walked until he was about 6 feet away. He stopped there. Not close enough to be threatening. Close enough to be clear. You spoke to my daughter this afternoon, he said. Brandon's expression did a thing. A micro-movement that a trained observer would catch and an untrained one would miss entirely. A flicker. Then the grin came back. I was just being friendly, he said. She's a pretty girl. She's 15, Michael said. I know how old she is. The words sat there. Then you understand, Michael said, why that conversation shouldn't happen again. Brandon tilted his head. The grin expanded. He looked at his friends, checking as people like him always did, whether his audience was watching. They were. Or what? Brandon said. What exactly happens if I decide to be friendly with your daughter again, Carter? Michael looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not flushed, not clenching his jaw or shifting his weight or doing any of the things that men did when anger was taking over their body without their full consent. He was still in this way that a parked aircraft carrier is still. The stillness of something that does not need to move to be powerful. Everything changes, Michael said. Brandon laughed. He actually laughed, a good full-chest laugh, the laugh of someone who had decided this was going to be a good story to tell later. Everything changes, he repeated. Okay, Carter. He looked at his friends again. One of them snorted. This man's threatening me. You see that this man with the Jeep from 2001 is standing in my driveway threatening me. It's not a threat, Michael said. It's information. He held Brandon's gaze for exactly 3 more seconds. Then he turned around and walked back through the gate and latched it behind him. He was back in his kitchen in 9 minutes. Sophie was sitting where he'd left her. What happened? I talked to him. And now he knows. She studied him. Knows what? Michael set the kettle on the stove. That his choices have consequences. He opened the cabinet for the tea. Chamomile or peppermint? She was quiet for a moment. Peppermint, she said finally. He nodded. She didn't ask any more questions about it that night, but she watched him from across the kitchen table while they drank tea the way she sometimes watched him carefully, like she was trying to solve a problem that kept changing shape. Like she was trying to understand who her father was underneath the garden and the old Jeep and the chamomile tea and the quiet evenings. Michael noticed. He always noticed. He just smiled and passed her the honey. Over the following 2 weeks, the situation with Brandon entered a new phase. Whatever Michael had said, or more precisely, whatever Michael hadn't said, whatever Brandon had read in that stillness, it had not produced the response Brandon expected. He had expected Michael imagined either fear or aggression. Either Michael backing down, immediately validating the hierarchy Brandon believed in, or Michael escalating, giving Brandon an excuse to respond the way his training had prepared him to respond. The complete absence of either seemed to do something to Brandon, not humility. Men like Brandon didn't arrive at humility easily or quickly. What it produced was irritation. A sense that something was wrong, some variable wasn't behaving correctly, and the only way to fix that was to add pressure until the equation resolved itself into something he recognized. The incidents became more deliberate. He started parking his truck so that the exhaust pointed directly at Michael's garden bed. He complained to the city about a fence post that was allegedly 2 inches over the property line. He made a point of standing in his driveway whenever Michael was in his yard and making comments to his friends, ostensibly but clearly designed to carry about people who drove old cars and wore old clothes and apparently had nothing better to do than play in their gardens like retirees. Michael tended his garden. Tom Kerrigan from 3 houses down came by one evening to check on him. Tom was 63, retired police detective, the kind of man who had put in enough time reading situations that his instincts were very nearly operational grade. "You doing all right?" Tom asked, leaning on the fence. "Fine," Michael said. "That kid's pushing buttons." "Yeah. You want me to make a call? Know a few people on the force still?" Michael looked at him. "Not yet." Tom studied him. He'd known Michael for 3 years, since Michael had helped him carry his wife's piano up a flight of stairs when they were moving back into the house after a flood, and he knew the way. Some men just knew about other men that there was more to Michael Carter than Michael Carter let on. "He doesn't know what he's dealing with, does he?" Tom said. Michael just picked up his trowel. "Nobody ever does until they do." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You gonna be okay when it finally goes sideways?" Michael looked up at. The late afternoon light was long and gold across the yard. "When it goes sideways," he said carefully, "the goal is to make sure nobody gets seriously hurt." Tom nodded slowly. "Including him." A beat. "Including him," Michael said. The thing about Cedar Valley. The thing that Michael had come to understand in the 3 years he'd lived there was that it was the kind of community that genuinely looked out for its own, but that also, like most communities, had a threshold. Below the threshold, people talked. They noted things. They kept aware. The Whitmore family had been crossing the threshold steadily for 3 weeks, and the community was beginning to react in the quiet, cumulative way of people who have been around long enough to know that things eventually come to a head. Maria Rodriguez stopped waving to Brandon when she passed his driveway. George Perkins filed a formal noise complaint. Patricia Chen, who ran the neighborhood association with the focused efficiency of someone who had once managed a hedge fund, sent a certified letter to Richard Whitmore outlining the relevant municipal ordinances. Richard Whitmore responded by calling Patricia Chen's personal cell phone and explaining, apparently in some detail, that he had a lawyer on retainer and that neighborhood association presidents did not frighten him. Patricia Chen called Michael afterward. "He's something else," she said. "Yeah." "Michael, how bad do you think this is going to get?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's going to get worse before it gets better," he said. "But I think it gets better. You're very calm about this." "I've dealt with worse." She paused. "Have you? Or is that just something you say?" He smiled. She couldn't see it, but she probably heard it. "Patricia, I'm going to handle this. Give me some time." "How much time?" "Not much," he said. "Something tells me Brandon Whitmore is not a patient person." He was right about that, as it turned out. He was right about that exactly. It was Sophie who gave him the information that closed the gap between waiting and acting. She came home on a Friday afternoon with her jaw set and her shoulders forward and went straight to her room without saying anything. Michael let her go. He made dinner chicken tikka masala from a recipe he'd learned from a man he'd served with who'd grown up in Birmingham, England, the son of Pakistani immigrants, the best cook Michael had ever known. He set the table, put Sophie's plate at her spot. She came down at 6. She sat. She didn't pick up her fork. "He was at school today," she said. Michael set down his fork. "Brandon. He came to pick up somebody, one of the seniors. He was in the parking lot and he saw me coming out and he—" She stopped. "He called me over, in front of everybody, like I was supposed to come when he called me." "Did you go?" "No." "Good. He said—" She pressed her lips together. "He said if my dad thought that little talk meant anything, he was even more pathetic than he looked. He said next time he sees you." She stopped again. "What did he say, Sophie?" "He said next time he sees you, he's going to make sure you understand the difference between a real man and a has-been." The kitchen was very quiet. Michael looked at his daughter. The tightness in her jaw. The fear that she was trying to cover with anger because she was 15 and brave and her mother's daughter. "Okay," he said. "That's all you're going to say. For right now, yeah." She stared at him. "He's going to do something, Dad. He's not just talking." "I know. So what are you going to do?" He picked up his fork. "Eat dinner," he said. "And then we're going to figure out what movie you want to watch tonight and tomorrow morning. I'm going to fix that gutter on the east side of the house and then—" "Dad?" He looked up. "I know you're not scared of him," she said. "That's what actually worries me." He was quiet for a moment. And then he said something that he hadn't planned to say, something that came from the place where he kept the things that were true. "Sophie, I have been in places where the cost of a mistake was not a bruised ego or a cracked rib, where the cost of a mistake was everything. People I was responsible for." He paused. "I know the difference between a dangerous situation and a man who needs to learn something about the world. Brandon Whitmore needs to learn something about the world. I don't think he's going to learn it any other way than the way he's setting up for himself." She was watching him. "But I need you to trust me," he said. "Can you do that?" A long moment. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I trust you." He nodded. "Good. Now eat your dinner. I spent 45 minutes on this." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, and that Michael thought as he watched her pick up her fork was something. Michael Carter had not talked about his service with anyone in Cedar Valley. Not in detail. Tom Kerrigan had probably guessed something close to the truth. Tom was perceptive, had good instincts, and knew how to recognize a man who'd been trained to operate under extreme pressure. Patricia Chen had probably noticed that Michael was unusually composed in situations that made other people fray. But nobody knew. Not really. Not the specifics. He hadn't meant it as deception. He simply didn't lead with it. He led with being Sophie's father, with being a neighbor, with being the person who could get a stuck bolt off an engine block and knew how to unclog a drain and would help you move a piano without being asked twice. He'd earned 23 years of the right to be something other than what they'd made him. But tonight, after Sophie went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, going cold in front of him, and thought about what was coming. Because it was coming. He could feel it with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading tactical situations, reading the point at which waiting stopped being strategic and became something else. Brandon Whitmore had made it personal. He'd brought it to Sophie's school. He'd sent a message. The message meant he was done waiting for Michael to flinch. It meant he was going to force the confrontation himself on his own terms in a setting of his choosing. Michael thought about the community barbecue that Patricia Chen had been organizing for 2 months. The annual Cedar Valley neighborhood gathering held in the park at the end of Maple Street. Every family on 6 blocks. Folding tables and potluck dishes and kids running through the grass and the easy warm noise of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable. He thought about the kind of person who looked at that gathering and saw an opportunity. I thought about what he would need to be when the moment came. Not a Navy SEAL, not a commander, not the man who had operated in dark places doing necessary things. Just a father, who happened to know exactly what he was doing. He drank the cold coffee, rinsed the cup, went to bed. Tomorrow he thought was going to be whatever it was going to be. He'd been ready for whatever it was going to be for a long time. The morning after his conversation with Sophie, Michael was up before 5. Not because he couldn't sleep. He slept fine. One of the things 23 years in the teams had given him that most people didn't expect was the ability to sleep anywhere, anytime, in any condition, for exactly as long as he needed to. When you operated in environments where sleep was a tactical resource, you learned to use it efficiently. You didn't lie awake turning things over. You solved what you could solve, set aside what you couldn't, and rested so you'd be sharp when the moment came. I was up before 5 because he wanted to be. He made coffee. Strong black the way he'd been making it since he was 22, and doing buds training in Coronado, where the instructors seemed to believe that sleep deprivation and cold water were the keys to building the kind of man who could be trusted with the hardest jobs in the world. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the street. Cedar Valley, at 4:58 in the morning, was exactly what it looked like. A small American town with good people in it. Most of them still asleep, trusting that the world outside their windows was safe enough to sleep through. He'd always thought that was what service was actually for. Not the missions, not the tactics, not the skill or the precision or the particular machinery of organized force. It was for this. For the right of ordinary people to sleep through the night in ordinary houses without having to think too hard about what was happening beyond their property line. I thought about that for a while. Then he thought about Brandon Whitmore. There was something Michael had learned early in his career, not in training, but in the field, in the particular curriculum, that only actual experience could teach about the difference between dangerous men and men who wanted to seem dangerous. The dangerous ones were quiet. They didn't need the world to know what they were capable of because the world's knowledge of it was irrelevant to them. They were dangerous not because they wanted to be, but because of what they'd trained for, what they'd done, what circumstances had built into them like load-bearing walls. Men who wanted to seem dangerous were something else entirely. They needed the performance. They needed the audience. They needed the world to validate what they privately weren't sure about. Brandon Whitmore was 19 years old and had never had a single person in his life who didn't eventually give him what he wanted. His father's money had buffered him from consequence. His physical size and martial arts training had buffered him from the kind of direct challenge that might have recalibrated his sense of where he stood in the world. He had moved through his entire life in a bubble constructed of wealth and deference, and what lived at the center of that bubble, the thing Brandon himself probably couldn't have named, was a terrifying uncertainty about what he actually was without any of it. Michael understood this not because he was particularly wise, but because he'd seen it before. Many times. In places where the gap between what a man thought he was and what he actually was could get people killed. He finished his coffee, put the mug in the sink, went to fix the gutter. He'd told Sophie he would fix the gutter on the east side of the house, and he was a man who did what he said he was going to do. The gutter had been pulling away from the fascia board since August, when the remnants of a tropical storm had come through Virginia with more rainfall than the area had seen in 3 years. He'd been getting to it on weekends between other things. He got his ladder and his tools and went outside in the early morning quiet and worked. It was the kind of work he liked best. Specific, physical. A clear problem with a clear solution that produced a visible result. He'd spent enough of his career dealing with problems that were none of those things. He was halfway through the job when he heard the door of the Whitmore house open. He didn't look over immediately. He kept working. He heard footsteps on the driveway next door, then the sound of someone opening the truck door, then the truck engine catching. He finished the section of gutter he was on, secured it, tested the connection with his hand. He looked over when the truck backed out. Brandon was behind the wheel. It was 6:45 in the morning. He was dressed in gym clothes, compression pants, a hoodie with the name of what was probably a fight gym in Atlanta across the chest. He backed the truck out, and before he pulled away, he looked over at Michael on the ladder. Their eyes met. Brandon held it for a moment. Then he raised his hand, not a wave, exactly more of the acknowledgement that was designed to look casual and didn't quite get there. Michael nodded once. Brandon drove away. Michael went back to the gutter. The acknowledgement meant something. He knew how to read it. Brandon had been up early enough to be leaving at 6:45 for a gym session, which meant he was in serious training. And he'd looked over consciously chosen to make eye contact before he left. It wasn't aggression, not exactly. It was closer to what happened before something the particular charged quality of a situation, finding its shape. Hi Mod, a mental note. Finished the gutter by 8. Made Sophie pancakes when she came downstairs and didn't say anything about what he'd seen. There were things you told your daughter and things you kept yourself. The gutter was fixed. That was the important information for this morning. The rest could wait. It didn't wait long. 3 days later at the Cedar Valley Grocery on Elm Street, Michael ran into George Perkins in the cereal aisle. George was 71 with a bad back and a good spirit, and he'd been a fixture on their block longer than most of the houses had been in their current condition. He and Michael had a standing arrangement where Michael helped with any yard work that required lifting or climbing, and George reciprocated by appearing periodically at Michael's door, with something his wife Edna had baked on the grounds that a man raising a daughter alone needed someone looking after him occasionally. George looked tired. "You doing okay?" Michael asked. "Been better." George moved his cart to the side so a woman with 2 kids could get by. "Those boys were at it again last night, 2 in the morning. Something with a generator out back, I think, running some kind of equipment. The noise." He made a gesture with his hand, dismissive and exhausted at the same time. "Filed another complaint this morning. I don't know what it does. Nothing, probably." "I'm sorry, George. Not your fault." He paused. "Actually, I heard something. From Patricia Chen." Michael waited. "She said that Richard Whitmore, the father, called the city council chairman. Personal friend, apparently. Or maybe just someone he donated money to. I don't know how those things work exactly. But she thinks the complaints are getting slowed down. Filed and set aside. Nothing happening with them." Michael absorbed this. "How sure is she?" "Patricia Chen is sure about things she says she's sure about," George said simply. "You know how she is." He did. Patricia Chen had the focused, factual precision of someone who had operated in high-stakes financial environments for decades, and when she told you something, she had already done the verification. "I'll make some calls," Michael said. George looked at him for a moment. Something in the older man's eyes, not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just sensed the possibility that they might not have to carry it alone. "You know," George said when you first moved in 3 years ago, "now I figured you for ex-military. Something about the way you carry yourself. That obvious. To an old man who paid attention to those things, yeah." He smiled slightly. "Never asked because it wasn't my business. Still isn't. But whatever you were, whatever you did, I think it might be the thing that matters here." Michael put his hand briefly on the older man's shoulder. "Get some rest, George. Tell Edna I said hello." He checked out and drove home and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside. Richard Whitmore had money and connections. That changed the shape of the situation. When the institutional mechanisms that were supposed to balance power got co-opted by the power, they were supposed to balance, you were no longer dealing with a local nuisance problem. You were dealing with a structural problem, and structural problems required different approaches. He went inside and made a phone call. Not to anyone in Cedar Valley. Not to anyone in Virginia, actually. He called a number in Washington, D.C., a man named David Park, who had a title at a defense consulting firm that meant essentially nothing, and a network that meant a great deal. They had served together for 6 years, including 2 deployments that had given them the kind of shared history that made every subsequent conversation feel slightly unreal in its plainness. "Michael," David said. He always picked up on the second ring regardless of the hour. "Good to hear from you." "You too. I need to ask you something." "Go." "A man named Richard Whitmore. Construction and real estate development based out of Atlanta. Has a company. I don't know the full name yet, probably something with Whitmore in it. I need to know if there's anything on him that I should know about." A brief pause. "This personal?" "He moved in next door." "Ah." Another pause. "His kid giving you trouble?" "His kid is giving my daughter trouble." The line was quiet for a moment. Michael could hear David processing this, the specific gravity of it, the way the information landed. David had met Sophie once at a 4th of July thing 2 years ago and had described her afterward as the kind of kid that makes you feel like the world might be okay. "I'll look into Whitmore," David said. "Probably nothing I can find quickly. These real estate developers usually keep their dirt at the level of boring financial misdoing, bid manipulation, permit irregularities, that kind of thing. But sometimes there's more." "I'm not looking to go after him," Michael said. "I'm just looking to understand what I'm dealing with." "Understood." A beat. "How are you otherwise?" "Good. Sophie's good. Good is good." Another pause. "Michael, how bad is this kid?" Michael thought about Sophie at the kitchen table with her jaw set and her shoulders forward. About the word she hadn't wanted to say. About the parking lot at the school. "He's the kind of bad that thinks being good-looking and able to fight makes him safe from consequences," Michael said. "He hasn't met consequences yet. Until now. Until now." "Okay," David said. "I'll get back to you. 2 days, maybe 3. Michael thanked him and hung up. He'd learned something fundamental about conflict early in his career. The preparation phase was everything. The moment itself, when it came, was often over in seconds. What determined the outcome was everything that happened before. The intelligence, the planning, the understanding of what you were actually dealing with versus what it appeared to be on the surface. I wasn't going to let the situation with Brandon turn into something reactive. He wasn't going to let himself be dragged into a confrontation on Brandon's terms, in Brandon's timing, with Brandon's rules. When this resolved, and it was going to resolve, he was certain of that. It was going to resolve on terms that he had shaped. Not through aggression, through clarity, through the kind of patience that most people couldn't sustain because they had never needed it badly enough to develop it. He put on water for tea. Sophie would be home in 40 minutes. It was while he was waiting for the kettle that he noticed the car in the driveway of the Whitmore house. He noticed it because he noticed things. It was simply how his brain worked, 3 decades of training, building, and attention to environmental detail that operated largely without conscious effort, and because it was a car he didn't recognize. Not one of the usual vehicles associated with the Whitmore household. Sleek, dark gray, out-of-state plates. Visitors. From somewhere else. He made a note of the plates. Not obsessively, not with any specific plan, just noted them the way you noted things that might be relevant in the filing system of a mind that had been trained to collect information and trust later judgment about what was worth keeping. The kettle boiled. He made tea. Sophie came home, and they talked about her chemistry test, which she thought she had done well on, and which she would find out about on Wednesday. She'd spent 3 hours on Sunday going through the material with a focus that Michael had always found slightly intimidating. The same focused intensity her mother had brought to anything that mattered to her. After dinner, they watched an old movie. Something from the 90s that Sophie said she'd been told to watch by a friend for reasons she couldn't fully explain, but which turned out to be genuinely good. At 9:30, she went to bed. At 9:45, Michael heard voices from the Whitmore property. Not the usual weekend party noise. Different, lower, more focused. He wasn't close enough to make out words, but there was a quality to it, the particular cadence of men in planning mode, which sounds different from men in celebration mode, in ways that are difficult to articulate, but unmistakable once you've heard it enough. He went to bed. I was already thinking about the community barbecue. Patricia Chen had mentioned it again at the last neighborhood association meeting, the annual gathering first Saturday of October at Maple Street Park. She'd said it like a regular announcement routine, part of the Cedar Valley calendar. But when her eyes had met Michael's briefly across the room, he'd heard something under the announcement. A question, or maybe a warning. The first Saturday of October was 11 days away. In Michael's experience, 11 days was not a long time. But it was enough time for things to develop in a specific direction if they were already developing. And they were already developing. He could feel the shape of it the way you felt a change in weather before it arrived. Not through any mystical sense, but through the accumulation of small data points that individually meant little and together meant something. Brandon had been training hard. The out-of-state visitors. The way Brandon had looked at him over the truck window. the escalating sequence of provocations, each one slightly beyond the last testing and probing. Building toward something. Brandon was planning something. For the barbecue, probably. The audience would be there. The whole neighborhood, his father's show, his stage. And Michael was the target. He thought about this very carefully. The thing was, he was right. Michael was certain he was right. And his options were limited in a particular way. He could avoid the barbecue, which was not something he was willing to do, because it would mean Sophie missing an event she looked forward to, and because it would mean ceding the situation to Brandon's definition of it. Or he could go. He was going to go. I was going to go, and he was going to be exactly who he was, which was a man who had been in more dangerous situations than Brandon Whitmore could conceptualize, and who had learned at considerable personal cost over many years that the measure of a man was not what he could do when provoked, but what he chose not to do. The next 10 days had a particular texture to them. The kind of before feeling that Michael recognized from other contexts, the quiet before an operation, when everything was in place, and the only thing left was to wait for the situation to complete itself. Brandon, meanwhile, escalated on schedule. 6 days before the barbecue, he confronted Michael directly for the first time since their conversation in the driveway. Michael was checking the mail at the end of the driveway. Brandon came out of his house and walked over, not running, not rushing, but with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. "Carter," he said. Michael took his mail out of the box, looked at it briefly. "Brandon, you called the noise complaint line on us. George Perkins called the noise complaint line on you. George Perkins has been coached by someone." Brandon's jaw was set. "The city investigator showed up. We had to shut down the gym equipment." Michael looked up. "You built a gym?" "In the garage, yeah." "That's fine. Noise ordinances apply at certain hours. You know that." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny?" "No. Simple and direct. I don't think any of this is funny." "I don't know what your problem is with me," Brandon said. He'd shifted slightly, the aggressive posture was still there, but something else had crept in, something that Michael identified as genuine bafflement. Brandon really didn't understand why Michael wasn't afraid of him. It was outside his experience. "I've been straight with you. I haven't. You told my daughter she was too pretty to be walking around with a pathetic has-been," Michael said. His voice was level. "You called her a word I won't repeat. You did this at her school in front of her classmates." Brandon's jaw tightened. "And I was playing around. She's 15 years old. He stopped. Something crossed his face that was almost complicated, almost real for about 3/4 of a second. Then the armor came back up. "Look, I just want to settle whatever this thing is between us, like men." "We can settle it right now," Michael said. "Stop speaking to my daughter. Stop making trouble for the neighbors. Follow the ordinances that apply to everyone on this street." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." Michael put his mail under his arm. "And I'm telling you that the version you're imagining isn't necessary. You can choose a different version." Brandon looked at him for a long moment. The bafflement was back stronger now, threaded through with frustration. He looked at Michael the way you look at a door that should open and isn't opening, and you can't figure out why. "The barbecue's next Saturday," Brandon said. It wasn't a threat. It was almost worse than a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who has decided how a story ends. "I know," Michael said. "You should come." "I'll be there." Brandon nodded once and walked back to his house. Michael went inside. He set the mail on the table, stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he called Tom Kerrigan. "Tom," he said when the older man picked up, "the barbecue next Saturday." "What about it?" "I need you to be there." A pause. "I was planning on going anyway." "Good. I need you there early. And Tom, if you still have those connections on the force." "Two of them are coming to the barbecue already, Jim Paulson and Derek Reeves. They come every year." Michael was quiet for a moment. This was the thing about communities. The thing that men like Richard Whitmore never understood. They saw individuals. They didn't see the network. The web of relationship and history and mutual obligation that connected ordinary people to each other and made them collectively something that isolated wealth and physical power could not easily overcome. "Good," he said. "I'll see you there." "Michael." Tom's voice dropped half a register. "What should I be expecting?" "Brandon Whitmore is going to try to make a point, in front of an audience. And I'm going to let him make it," Michael said. "Up to a point." A long pause. "How far is the point?" "Far enough that the situation resolves itself," Michael said. "Not so far that anyone gets seriously hurt." Tom absorbed this. "You've done this before." It wasn't quite a question. "Different context," Michael said. "Similar principle." "Okay." Tom sounded like a man who had decided to trust something he didn't fully understand yet. "I'll be there at noon." "Thank you." He hung up, looked out the window at the Whitmore property. The dark gray car with the out-of-state plates was gone. It had left sometime in the night 2 days ago. He'd found out from a kid down the street, 15-year-old Marcus Webb, who had the particular gift of noticing the exact things adults didn't notice, that the car had come and gone twice in the week before. Marcus said he'd heard voices from inside the garage, the kind of voices that sounded like instruction. Training, maybe. Brandon had brought in help. A trainer, probably. Someone from his Atlanta gym come to sharpen him up for something. Michael sat with this information for a moment. Then, with the particular calm that came not from the absence of concern, but from many years of learning how to carry concern without letting it drive the wheel. He went to the backyard and spent 45 minutes doing the workout routine that had been his since Coronado. No equipment necessary, just the body and gravity and the discipline that came from knowing exactly what you were made of and maintaining it with the same care you'd give anything valuable. I wasn't thinking about proving anything to anyone. He was thinking about Saturday. Sophie found him in his kitchen afterward, eating a banana and reviewing his notes from a defense consulting project he'd been working on part-time, the kind of advisory work that kept his credentials current and his mind sharp, and that paid quietly enough that he didn't need to explain it to anyone. "You seem focused," she said, getting juice from the fridge. "I'm always focused. More focused than usual." She looked at him over the refrigerator door. "Is it the barbecue thing?" He looked up. She put the juice on the counter. "I know Brandon said something to you. I saw you two talking from my window." "You were watching from your window." "I was doing homework. The window is there. I noticed." He put down the pen. "He told me to come to the barbecue." "And you're going?" "We're going." Sophie was quiet for a moment. She had her mother's way of thinking something through before she responded, the slight stillness, the barely visible process of considering and arranging. "Are you going to fight him?" "I'm going to handle the situation." "Dad, are you going to fight him?" He looked at her. "I'm not going to go looking for a fight. But if he comes looking, then I'll be ready." He held her gaze. "Sophie, I need you to stay close to the Kerrigan family when we're there. Tom and his wife. I need you not to get between whatever happens and where you're standing." She processed this. "You know something's going to happen." "I think something's likely." "And you're still going?" "Yeah." "Why?" He thought about how to say it, about what was true and what was actually true. "Because running from it doesn't make it go away," he said finally. "It just follows you home, and I'm not letting that come into our home." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, a kind of recognition, like she was seeing something she hadn't quite seen before, or had seen, but hadn't let herself hold. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. I'll stay with the Kerrigans." He nodded. "Thank you." She picked up her juice, started for the stairs, stopped. "Dad." "Yeah. Whatever you did before, whatever you were, I know it was important. I know it was real." She paused. "I just want you to come home after the barbecue. That's all I want." He felt something in his chest that didn't have a name, or had too many names. "I'll come home," he said. She went upstairs. He sat with it for a while, the weight of it, the cleanness of it, the particular kind of love that comes from a person who knows you have the capacity for danger and trusts you anyway. Then he went back to his notes. Saturday was 4 days away. He had a few things left to do. On Wednesday, David Park called back. Richard Whitmore, David said without preamble. Whitmore Construction and Development. Founded 2009. Atlanta-based. Revenue around $40 million last year. Clean. On the surface. Below the surface, he's had 3 city contracts in the Atlanta metro area where the bid process looks irregular. Not prosecuted. Reviewed once by a state commission and cleared, but the investigator who cleared him left the commission 8 months later to join a company with ties to Whitmore subsidiaries. Michael was quiet. Pay to play. Looks like it. Nothing provable with what I found in 2 days, but it's there. A pause. Michael, this guy operates in a particular way. He uses relationships and money to create buffer space between himself and his decisions. He's not directly dirty exactly. It's more like everything around him is positioned so that the dirt never lands on him. Exactly. Another pause. His son has 2 arrests, both from 3 years ago in Atlanta. Both sealed. He was 17. I can't see the details, but the charges were serious enough to require sealing. Michael felt something shift. Not surprise. Not quite. Something more like the sensation of a picture that had been slightly blurry coming into focus. Assault. Almost certainly, based on what I could infer from adjacent records. David's voice was measured. Michael, this kid isn't just a bully. He has a pattern. I know. You might want to think about. I have, Michael said. I've thought about it. I need to let this play out in a way that the community sees clearly. If I preempt it, if I go to the authorities now with inference and sealed records and a neighbor dispute, it looks like I'm the aggressor. And Richard Whitmore's money means that perception matters more than it should. A long silence. You're going to let him come to you. I'm going to be at a community event with 60 of my neighbors, 2 off-duty cops, and my daughter in safe company, Michael said. And I'm going to let Brandon Whitmore make the choices he's already decided to make, in front of witnesses. And then, Michael said, the truth becomes visible. Another silence. Longer. You were always very good at this, David said. The part where you made a situation clarify itself. I learned from people who were better at it than me. A sound that might have been a laugh. Be careful. I'll be careful. And Michael. Yeah. Tell Sophie I said hi. Michael smiled. I will. He ended the call and sat for a while in the quiet house, with the afternoon light moving across the kitchen floor. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. A dog barked twice and was answered by a dog farther off. From somewhere above him, he could hear Sophie's music faint through the ceiling, something with acoustic guitar, something slow and a little melancholy, in the way that 15-year-olds were allowed to be on a Wednesday afternoon. He had 3 days. He thought about Brandon Whitmore, the sealed arrests, the pattern, the youth of it, the particular tragedy of a kid who had been given everything except any reason to develop into a person who didn't need to take things from others. He didn't feel contempt exactly. He felt something closer to a clear-eyed recognition of what Brandon was and how he'd gotten there and what it was going to take to interrupt the path he was on. Not Michael's fist. Something harder than that in the long run. Something that forced an encounter with reality that Brandon had been successfully avoiding his entire life. Michael had encountered reality in his career more times and in more forms than he cared to count. He knew what it did to people. He knew what it could make possible. He also knew that it didn't always take. Some people encountered reality and still found ways to explain it away, to restore the story they needed to tell about themselves. But some people didn't. Some people, when they finally met something they couldn't buy or charm or overpower, experienced something that cracked the shell. He genuinely hoped that Brandon Whitmore was one of those. He went upstairs, knocked on Sophie's door. Yeah. Friend of mine says hi. She turned down the music. Which friend? David Park. You met him 2 4th of Julys ago. A pause. The serious one with the glasses. He thinks you're the best argument for the world being okay. Another pause. Longer. Then, that's really nice. Yeah. Dad. Yeah. Is everything okay? He stood on the other side of her door in the quiet house in the small town he had chosen, because it was the kind of place where people slept safely through the night. He thought about Brandon Whitmore and Richard Whitmore and the sealed arrests and the barbecue and the truth that was going to become visible one way or another on Saturday. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be," he said. He meant it. "Okay." Her voice was small and trusting in the way that nothing else in the world was that he had never deserved and had spent 4 years working to be worthy of. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Sophie." He went back downstairs. Saturday was 3 days away. He made dinner, ate alone, washed the dishes, and sat on the back porch in the cooling October dark. He was ready. Saturday arrived the way important days sometimes do, quietly without announcement, like it was trying not to make a big deal of itself. The sky was clear. The air had that particular October quality to it, cool enough for a jacket, but not cold enough to keep anyone inside. Michael was up at 5 again. Coffee, window, the street. The Whitmore house was dark. He stood there for a few minutes drinking his coffee in the quiet, thinking about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed over decades, and which most people never learned, the ability to simply be in a moment without filling it with anticipation or dread. The barbecue started at noon. It was currently 5:12 in the morning. He had time. High-mod pancakes. Read for an hour. Did his workout in the backyard when the light came up. By the time Sophie came downstairs at 8:45, he had already been productive for nearly 4 hours, and felt the particular settled quality of a man who had done what he needed to do before the day asked him to do anything. She came into the kitchen in her usual way, half asleep, hair in a ponytail, reaching for the orange juice before she'd said a word to anyone. She poured a glass and stood at the counter and looked at him. "You're very calm," she said. "I'm always calm." "Dad, you've been wiping the same section of counter for like a minute." He looked down. The sponge was in his hand, and the counter was objectively very clean. He set the sponge down. "Eat something. We leave at 11:30. She watched him for a moment with the focused attention of a person doing a calculation. Then she poured cereal and sat down and ate, and they were quiet together, in the way they were sometimes quiet, not uncomfortably, not because there was nothing to say, but because they'd lived in the same house long enough to know that not everything needed to be spoken. At 10:15, Michael got a text from Tom Kerrigan. "Already at the park. Tables are set up. Paulson and Reeves are here. Brought their wives." He texted back, "Good. See you at noon." At 10:45, he heard the Whitmore garage open. Not the usual morning sounds, the casual, incidental noise of a household starting its day. This was organized, deliberate. He heard voices, multiple of them, and the sound of vehicles being moved. Through the kitchen window, he could see at the edge of his sightline at least 3 cars in or near the Whitmore driveway. The Jim car from out of state was back. So were 2 others he didn't recognize. Brandon had assembled his people. Michael checked the time. 11:02. He went upstairs. Put on a clean pair of dark jeans and a gray Henley, and his old field jacket, not for any strategic reason, simply because it was cool enough and he liked the jacket. A worn Carhartt that had been with him through 3 New England winters and a lot of yard work. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for exactly long enough to confirm that he looked like himself and not like a man preparing for a performance, and then he went downstairs. Sophie was already by the door, backpack over one shoulder. She'd volunteered to help Patricia Chen with the setup, so she was bringing craft supplies for the kids' table, which was an arrangement she'd made independently, and which made Michael feel something warm and uncomplicated. "You look like yourself," she said, looking at his jacket. "That's the goal." "Is that actually the goal today?" He held the door open for her. "It's always the goal." They walked together to Maple Street Park, which was 3 blocks away, close enough that most of the neighborhood went on foot. The park was already active when they arrived. Patricia Chen had been there since 10, and the transformation of an ordinary neighborhood, green space, into something that felt genuinely festive was entirely her doing. Folding tables in a long row, each covered with a different colored cloth. Charcoal grills at the far end already going, sending up the particular smoke of fall barbecue that triggered something deep and seasonal in the people passing by. A card table near the entrance with name tags which Patricia always insisted on, and which everyone always ribbed her about, and which everybody secretly appreciated. Tom Kerrigan was by the grills. He was talking to a heavy-set man with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular posture of someone who had spent a career walking into situations other people walked out of. Jim Paulson. Off-duty, 28 years on the force. The kind of cop who had learned long ago that the best thing you could do in a tense situation was be visibly calm and let the situation reveal itself. Tom saw Michael arrive and gave a single nod. Michael nodded back. He found Sophie a station at the kids' craft table. She greeted a handful of younger kids by name, remembered which one was allergic to the markers, with a certain kind of ink, which told him things about his daughter that he already knew, but never got tired of knowing. And then he moved through the gathering crowd, in the easy, unhurried way that didn't look like anything except a man at a neighborhood party. How was cataloging? Positions. Sightlines. The natural flow of people through the space. Where the crowd was densest, where it thinned, where a confrontation would be most visible, and where it would be least contained. I didn't think of this as military thinking exactly. It was just thinking. The same way some people automatically calculated tips in their heads, or evaluated the structure of a sentence when they read his brain had been wired to process space and people and risk, and it did so without being asked. The Whitmore family arrived at 12:22. I knew it before he saw it from the slight shift in the crowd, the way conversation near the entrance tilted and quieted, the way heads turned in the specific synchronized manner that meant something notable had appeared. He looked up from his conversation with George Perkins. George had brought Edna's famous potato salad and was very pleased about the reception it was receiving, and there they were. Richard Whitmore came in first. He was dressed for the occasion in the way that men who didn't belong somewhere sometimes dressed for occasions, just slightly too well. A blazer over a collared shirt at a neighborhood barbecue. The clothes of a man signaling status rather than comfort. He was smiling broadly, shaking hands, introducing himself to people he'd never met, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to working rooms. Behind him came Brandon, and behind Brandon came four other young men, the friends from the gym, recognizable from their posture and their build, and the particular quality of their attention, which was not the relaxed attention of men at a neighborhood party, but something else. They scanned the space. They were looking for something. Or someone. Brandon caught Michael's eye from across the park. He smiled. It was a specific kind of smile. The kind that meant, I'm ready. Michael looked at him for a moment, then turned back to George and said, That potato salad really is exceptional. You should get a plate before it runs out. George looked at him with the knowing expression of a man who understood that Michael was making a choice. You're not worried. About the potato salad. Michael. I'm fine, George. He put a hand on the older man's arm. Go get Edna and find somewhere comfortable to sit. Stay on that side. He nodded toward the east end of the park, away from the grills, away from the Whitmore cluster. George looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded and did exactly that. The next 40 minutes were a slow burn. Richard Whitmore moved through the party like a man campaigning for something, making a point to speak to everyone, turning on a charm that was polished enough to mostly work and transparent enough to mostly not. He found Patricia and spoke to her for a full 4 minutes, and Michael watched Patricia's face from across the park, the professional courtesy that concealed absolutely nothing about how she felt about him. Brandon and his friends congregated near the grills getting food, talking among themselves. From where Michael stood, he could see that Brandon was performing relaxation, the loose posture, the easy laugh, the look of a man having a good time at a party while his eyes tracked Michael constantly. Tom Kerrigan materialized at Michael's shoulder at 12:58. He brought 4 guys, Tom said quietly, not looking at Michael, looking at the food table. I see them. Jim's aware. Good. How do you want to play this? I don't want to play anything, Michael said. I want to eat a burger and talk to my neighbors and have a normal afternoon. And if Brandon doesn't want that, then we'll see what Brandon wants. Tom was quiet for a moment. You know, in 28 years on the force, Jim Paulson has seen a lot of situations. He pulled me aside when the Whitmores came in and said something. What did he say? He said that kid walks like he's already decided something. Michael looked across the park at Brandon, watched the easy performed relaxation, the tracking eyes. He has, Michael said. It happened at 117, not because anything built to it in a visible dramatic way. It happened the way these things usually happened. Michael knew, not with a clear beginning that everyone recognized, but with a small action that crossed a line, and the crossing of the line made everything that followed feel inevitable. Brandon walked over to the kids' craft table. Sophie was there, helping a 7-year-old named Lily Chen. Patricia's granddaughter glued something to a piece of cardboard. There were 6 other kids at the table, 2 parents on the bench nearby. Brandon stopped at the edge of the table. "Hey, Sophie," he said. Sophie looked up. Her posture changed immediately. Michael could see it from 30 feet away, the slight stiffening the thing her body did before her expression caught up with it. "Hi," she said. Flat, careful. "Cool little project," Brandon said, looking at the table. He was performing friendliness. It was a good performance. The parents on the bench didn't see what was underneath it. "Thanks," Sophie said. She looked back at Lily's project. "Hey, I just want to say..." Brandon lowered his voice, but not enough, not quite. "I hope there's no hard feelings between your dad and me." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophie said. "Come on." The smile. "You know what I mean." One of the parents on the bench was beginning to pay attention. Michael was already moving. Not fast. Not visibly urgent. Just moving through the crowd with the particular efficiency of someone who knows exactly where they need to be and takes the fastest route that doesn't alarm anyone. He came around the end of the craft table and stood between Brandon and Sophie. "Hey, Brandon," he said. Brandon looked at him. The smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened. "Carter, hey man, great party." "Yeah, come take a walk with me." It was not a question. Brandon looked at him for a moment, clocking the directness, the absence of hostility, the plain authority of it. Around them, a few people had noticed. The parents on the bench. A couple standing nearby. The social field of the party had shifted slightly the way a room shifts when something real happens in it. "Sure," Brandon said. "Let's walk." They moved away from the craft table toward the east end of the park, away from the main crowd. Brandon's friends had clocked the movement. Michael could see in his peripheral vision the attention shift in their cluster by the grills. They stopped at the edge of the tree line, far enough from the main gathering to be private, close enough to be visible. "You came to my daughter," Michael said. "After everything." Brandon's posture changed. The performed relaxation dropped like a coat coming off. What was underneath it was younger and sharper and more genuinely dangerous, not because Brandon was actually as dangerous as he thought he was, but because he was capable of doing damage without calibration. "Your daughter is fine," Brandon said. "I was being friendly." "You were sending me a message." Brandon shrugged. The shrug was almost honest. "Maybe." "Then here's mine," Michael said. "We can end this today, right here, right now, with no one getting hurt and no one losing anything that matters. That's an option." "And the other option?" Michael looked at him. "You already know the other option." Brandon studied him. Something was happening in his face. A calculation, a recalibration, the process of a young man who had decided something before he got here, but was in this moment encountering the reality of the person in front of him in a way that his preparation hadn't quite accounted for. There was a version of Brandon Whitmore, some younger, different version, some parallel kid raised in different circumstances who might have taken the exit Michael was offering, who might have felt in the directness of the offer, the implicit respect of it, something that made the exit feel like something other than retreat. This Brandon in this moment could not take it. He had brought 4 people. His father was across the park. He had been building to this for weeks. He had a story about himself that required this to end a specific way. "I think," Brandon said slowly, "you don't know what you're dealing with." Michael was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said. That's why I gave you the option." Brandon smiled. "Old man, I have a black belt and 3 regional titles. You've got a garden and a 2009 Jeep." "Brandon, let's settle it," Brandon said. "Right now, in front of everyone." He raised his voice slightly, not shouting but enough. Enough for the people at the edges of the park to turn. "I want everyone here to see what you actually are." The crowd was turning now. Michael could feel it the way attention in a shared space has a physical quality, a weight that lands on you from all directions simultaneously. He looked at Sophie. She was standing by the craft table 30 feet away, her hands still and her face very still. The Kerrigan family was near her. Tom's wife Carol had her hand gently on Sophie's shoulder, which meant Tom had briefed her, which meant Sophie was safe. Sophie's eyes found Michael's. What he saw there was not fear. It was trust. She trusted him. Not because she didn't understand the risk, but because she knew who he was underneath everything, underneath the old jacket and the quiet life and the pancakes on Saturday mornings. She had always known, Michael thought. Kids always knew, even when the adults around them thought they were protecting them from knowledge. He turned back to Brandon. He took off his jacket. The crowd, which had been murmuring, went very quiet. Brandon misread it immediately. He saw the jacket come off, and he saw what he expected to see: a middle-aged man with a decent build and no visible fighting background, getting ready to get hurt. He glanced at his friends. One of them gave him a nod. He raised his hands in a fighter's guard, the practice-trained posture of someone who had spent thousands of hours in a gym. It was good. Michael recognized it. It was genuinely good technique. Brandon came forward. The first combination was fast and clean, and would have been very impressive in a gym against a training partner who was expecting it. Brandon had speed, and he had power, and his footwork was better than most civilians would have noticed. Michael was not a civilian. He moved but not away, which was what Brandon expected. Sideways inside the arc of the combination, changing the geometry of the engagement so completely that Brandon's momentum carried him forward into empty space. Brandon adjusted. He was good enough to adjust quickly. He reset and came again, this time lower, going for a grip that would have let him control the engagement and bring it to the ground where he was trained to be comfortable. Michael stopped it. Not with a strike. With a redirection. A precise repositioning that used Brandon's own forward drive against him. The kind of movement that required no strength and left no mark, and was so economical that most of the crowd didn't fully understand what they'd seen. Brandon was off balance. He recovered. His face had changed. The smile was gone. "What the—" he started. Michael said nothing. Brandon came again. This time with real commitment, real power, no performance. The thing underneath the performance. The actual trained fighter who had genuinely won 3 regional titles, and who was now, for the first time in his life, encountering something he had not trained for, because you could not train for it in a gym. You could not train to fight someone who had spent 23 years operating in conditions where being wrong meant everything, who had absorbed and developed and refined a kind of physical competence that gym work could approach but not replicate. Michael moved through it. Through the attacks, not away from them, meeting force with angle strength, with leverage, commitment, with redirection. I was not performing. He was not playing. He was doing the minimum necessary with the maximum efficiency, the way he had always been taught: economy of action, clarity of purpose, not one thing more than the situation required. And yet the gap was absolute. Brandon landed nothing, not one clean strike. He was trying, genuinely physically trying, burning through the trained conditioning that had made him feel invincible in every context he'd operated in before this moment, and it was not working. The crowd had gone completely still. Richard Whitmore, from his position near the food tables, was watching with an expression that had started as satisfaction and shifted through confusion, and was arriving slowly somewhere he'd never been before. Brandon's friends by the grills had stopped eating. Tom Kerrigan and Jim Paulson were positioned where they needed to be. At some point that Michael couldn't have precisely identified, the shift happened. Brandon was breathing hard. His guard had dropped, not from choice, but from the first true physical exhaustion of a confrontation that wasn't going the way any of his experience had told him it would go. He came forward one more time slow now, and Michael stepped aside and placed one hand on Brandon's shoulder and used the same mechanical precision that had redirected every other thing Brandon had thrown. And this time, it was enough. Brandon went down to one knee on the grass, not thrown hard, not slammed, just brought there with a technical precision that left him no option. They stayed there for a moment. Brandon on one knee, Michael's hand on his shoulder. The crowd around them absolutely silent. "I'm not your enemy," Michael said quietly. Only Brandon could hear him. "I never was." Brandon was breathing, looking at the grass. Michael could feel through the hand on his shoulder the exact quality of what was happening in the younger man, the collapse of something, some structure that had been load-bearing and was no longer. "Who are you?" Brandon said. It was barely above a whisper. "I'm Sophie's father," Michael said. He let go. He stepped back. He picked up his jacket from the grass where he'd set it, and he walked back toward his daughter. The crowd parted for him. Not dramatically, not like a movie moment where everything pauses and swells. Just the natural, quiet, instinctive parting of people who have witnessed something they recognize as significant, even if they can't immediately name what it is. Jim Paulson caught his eye as he passed. The detective gave him a single nod, the nod of a professional who had seen what he needed to see and would handle the rest. Tom met him at the edge of the crowd. "You okay?" Tom said. "Fine." Tom looked at him for a moment. "You barely moved." "I moved enough." He found Sophie at the craft table. Carol Kerrigan stepped back as he approached. Sophie looked at him. Looked at him. The way she'd been looking at him for 4 years. The careful, loving, complicated look of a girl trying to know who her father fully was. "Hey," he said. "Hey." Her voice was steady. "You okay?" "Yeah." "You..." "Yeah." A pause. "Lily's project is almost done," she said, nodding at the 7-year-old who was still very focused on her cardboard and glue and seemed to have found the entire preceding event significantly less interesting than her craft project. "She wants to add more glitter." "She should add more glitter," Michael said. He sat down on the bench next to the craft table. After a moment, Sophie sat down next to him, across the park. Brandon Whitmore was getting up from the grass. 2 of his friends were helping him. His father had crossed the park and was beside him now, and Michael could see from the distance the quality of the conversation. Richard's face had the look of a man processing something he hadn't budgeted for. One of the parents from the bench, a man named Steve Alderman, whom Michael had known for 2 years, a high school football coach with a practical approach to most things, had come to stand nearby. He looked at Michael for a moment. "You want to tell me," Steve said carefully, "what exactly that was?" "That was a neighbor dispute," Michael said. Steve looked at him for another moment. "You know my brother did 20 years in the Army." "I didn't know that." "He walked like you," Steve said simply, and went back to the grill. Patricia Chen appeared at 12 minutes after the confrontation with the focused efficiency of a woman who had managed crises at a significantly larger scale than a neighborhood barbecue. She crouched briefly next to Michael. "You need anything?" "I'm good, Patricia." "The Whitmores are leaving." She paused. "Richard is on his phone." "I figured." "He looks angry." "He would." She studied him. "Michael, what you did the way I've never seen anything like that. You've been watching too many gym videos." "I'm serious." He looked at her. "The situation is handled, Patricia. The rest of it, whatever Richard tries to do next, that'll be its own thing. But today is handled." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she straightened up, smoothed her jacket and said, "I made 3 pies. You should take one home." "Sophie likes the apple. I know what Sophie likes." She was already walking. He watched her go, looked back at the park. The crowd was settling back into the ordinary rhythms of a neighborhood gathering, conversations, resuming plates, being refilled, children running. The particular resilience of ordinary life, he thought. The capacity of people to process extraordinary things and return to ordinary ones without losing either. Brandon and his friends were gone by 1:47. Richard Whitmore lingered for another 20 minutes, which told Michael something about him. The inability to exit a situation that hadn't resolved in his favor. The need to maintain the appearance of not having been affected. He talked to several people, none of whom had much to say to him. His posture gradually went from aggressive to something more uncertain, like a man standing in a room trying to find the door. He left at 2:08. Michael noticed the exact time. Tom came to sit next to him on the bench at 2:15. Jim is going to file a report, Tom said. Brandon's crew is not all clean. Jim ran the plates on the Atlanta cars while the thing was happening. 2 of them have priors. 1 of them has an outstanding warrant in Georgia for assault. Michael absorbed this. Brandon know that? Probably not. Tom paused. Jim's going to make some calls this afternoon. Michael nodded. And Michael. Tom stopped. What? Brandon's friends were recording, on their phones. I saw them. Michael was quiet for a moment. That's fine. You're not worried about that. He thought about it. What would a video show? A young man attacking an older man who didn't attack back, who absorbed everything thrown at him and redirected it without causing harm, who stopped the moment the situation was resolved. A middle-aged man in a worn jacket who moved like something most people had never seen outside of a movie, and who had walked away the moment he could. No, he said. I'm not worried about it. Tom looked at him for a long moment with the accumulated understanding of a man who had spent his career reading people and situations and who was making a series of quiet revisions to what he thought he'd understood. Who were you, Tom said, before you came here? Michael looked at the park, at the kids running, at Sophie laughing at something Lily Chen had said, the particular full laugh that he hadn't heard enough of in the years after Ellen died, and that had been coming back slowly, incrementally. The way spring comes back, not all at once, but in accumulation, in the way that good things generally came back, if you were patient enough and created the right conditions. I was someone who did what needed doing, Michael said. And now, he looked at his daughter. Now I'm doing what needs doing, he said. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll get us some of Patricia's pie. Get the apple, Michael said. Sophie'll want it. He sat on the bench in the October afternoon and let the ordinary life of Cedar Valley move around him and thought about nothing in particular and was exactly where he was. The pie was good. Patricia Chen made an apple pie that was by any objective measure better than it had any right to be from a woman who described baking as a stress management tool rather than a passion. Michael ate a slice while the October afternoon softened around him, and Sophie sat beside him with her own slice, and they didn't talk much, and that was exactly right. He drove them home at 3:45. Sophie went upstairs without being asked, which meant she was processing. She did that. She'd done it since she was small. The retreat to her room when things were too big to talk about. Yet the need to sit alone with something before she could find the words for it. He understood this. He did the same thing only for him. The retreat was the backyard or the garage or a long drive on the county roads outside Cedar Valley, where the signal on his phone got weak and the world got quiet. Haimad T. sat at the kitchen table, looked at his hands. They were steady. They had always been steady. Even in the worst moments, in the places where the cost of a shaking hand was absolute, his hands had been steady. He didn't know if that was training or constitution or some combination that couldn't be separated out, but it was one of the things about himself that he had come to simply accept, the way you accepted the color of your eyes or the way you walked. His phone buzzed at 4:19. Tom Kerrigan. He picked up. Jim made the call, Tom said. The warrant out of Georgia is real. They're picking up one of Brandon's crew tonight. Which one? The big one. The one who was doing the recording. Michael was quiet for a moment. He thought about the recording. The video that Brandon's friend had taken, which would now be part of a police interaction. The video's going to be seen by law enforcement. Jim already asked about it, Tom said. He says what's on it is clear. You defended yourself. Brandon came at you multiple times. You didn't strike him once. I know. Michael, Jim says he's never seen anything like what's on that video. In 28 years. He wants to know. Tell him I appreciate the kind words. A pause. That's all you want to say. That's all I want to say. Tom accepted this with the grace of a man who had learned long ago that some answers weren't his to have. Richard Whitmore was on the phone when he left the park. Jim thinks he was calling a lawyer. Probably. You prepared for that. He thought about David Park, about the information on Whitmore Construction and the bid irregularities, and the investigator who had left the state commission for a company with ties to Richard's subsidiaries. He thought about the particular way that people who operated in the buffer zone between legal and illegal sometimes found when they pushed on the wrong pressure point that the buffer zone was smaller than they thought. I'm prepared, Michael said. Okay. Tom let out a breath. One more thing. Brandon Jim talked to him before they left, just briefly, asked him a couple standard questions about the incident. He said Brandon was... Tom paused, selecting the word carefully, different. Different how? Quiet. Jim said he was very quiet, not angry quiet, just quiet. A pause. He said Brandon kept looking back at the park when they were talking, like he was trying to figure out something. Michael held this thought. Thanks, Tom, he said. You sure you don't need anything tonight? I'm sure. Go be with your wife. He put the phone down. He sat with the Tom's last words for a while. Brandon quiet. Not angry. Looking back at the park. Trying to figure something out. He had seen this before, not often, but often enough to know what it looked like. The particular confusion of a person whose operating assumptions have been fundamentally disrupted. The disorientation that happened when the world stopped behaving according to the rules you had organized your life around. It could go multiple ways from there. He knew that too. Some people, when that happened, doubled down. The disruption read as threat, and the response was to dig in harder, to rebuild the old story, with more aggressive materials, to find a way to make the world confirm what they needed it to confirm. Richard Whitmore was almost certainly going to do exactly that. Some people, when the foundation cracked, found that what came through the crack was light. He hoped for Brandon's sake it was the latter. The week that followed had the quality of something holding its breath. Nothing immediately happened. Richard Whitmore did not call. No lawyer's letter arrived. The noise complaints that had been filed and apparently stalled began inexplicably to move again through the municipal system. Michael suspected Jim Paulson had quietly greased some mechanism there, though he didn't ask and Jim didn't say. The noise ordinance violation notices were officially delivered to the Whitmore property on Tuesday. Brandon was not visible. The Jim car from out of state was gone by Sunday morning. The weekend visitors didn't come back. The truck was in the driveway, but it didn't move much, and the garage that had been converted into a training space stayed closed. Sophie came down to breakfast on Monday and said, "The Whitmore house is different." Different how? Quiet. She poured juice. Like really quiet. The whole weekend I barely heard anything. That's probably good. Yeah. She looked at him. Dad, what actually happened to Brandon? He thought about how to say it. About what was true and accessible, and what was true and not yet hers to carry. He encountered something he didn't have a framework for, Michael said. She considered this. Because of you. Because of the situation. That's the same thing. Not exactly, he said. I just showed up as what I am. The rest of it, what he does with it, that's his. She sat with this. Do you think he'll be better? After? The question surprised him slightly. Not because it was unexpected from her. Sophie had always had that quality. The ability to see the person inside the behavior. The separability of what someone did and who they were, but because of the directness of it. The genuine interest. I don't know, he said. I hope so. Me too, she said. She meant it. He could tell. And that he thought was one of the things about her that made everything worth it. The capacity for that kind of uncomplicated hope for someone who had frightened her, had diminished her, had walked through her space uninvited and left something unwanted behind. She still hoped for him. He put an extra piece of toast on her plate. Tuesday brought the first sign of what Richard Whitmore was going to do. Michael was in the garage when Patricia Chen called. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and picked up. He's going after the incident report, Patricia said. No preamble. She had never been a preamble person. His lawyer filed a complaint with the Cedar Valley Police Department this morning. Claims you were the aggressor. Claims Brandon was defending himself. Michael leaned against the workbench. Okay. He has a video. I know. Michael, his video is edited. One of his son's friends cut it. It starts 15 seconds in. He was quiet for a moment. What's in the first 15 seconds? Brandon initiating. Walking toward you aggressively. Making the first move. A pause that was almost a beat. Without that 15 seconds, what you see is a middle-aged man throwing a younger one to the ground. He felt something sharpen. Not anger, or not only anger, something colder and more precisely focused. Where did you get this? Jim Paulson. He has the full video from 2 other people who were recording. Mrs. Alderman had her phone out for practically the entire incident, full 15 minutes continuous. The thing about communities. The thing that men like Richard Whitmore never understood was not just that people knew each other. It was that they paid attention to each other. Mrs. Alderman, whose husband had spoken to Michael on the bench afterward, had been standing 15 feet away with an unobstructed view and an unedited recording for the entire duration. Jim's already been in contact with the department, Patricia said. He submitted the full video an hour ago. The complaint is going to go nowhere. He exhaled slowly. Patricia, you should know Richard may escalate this, beyond the police complaint. I know. Her voice was steady. He made calls this morning, to people on the city council. 2 of them called me directly to give me a heads up, which tells you something about how those calls went. Michael almost smiled. How'd they go? Apparently, he suggested that the neighborhood association was running some kind of, and this is a direct quote from Councilman Bradley, vigilante operation, and that I personally had organized it. What did Bradley say? He said that Patricia Chen had been on his constituent services list for 11 years, and that if she was organizing something, it was probably a bake sale, and that Richard should consult his attorney before making accusations. A beat. Bradley and I went to the same church for 8 years. Okay, Michael said. Let Jim handle the police side. Don't engage with Richard directly. I wasn't planning to, Patricia said. But Michael, what are you planning to do about him? He's not going to stop. I know. So. He thought about David Park. About bid irregularities and state commission investigators who changed jobs in suspicious sequences. About the way certain kinds of pressure applied to certain kinds of structures caused those structures to reveal their own weaknesses. I'm going to let Richard Whitmore be Richard Whitmore, he said. That's usually enough. She was quiet for a moment. That sounds like something a very patient person says. Or a very tired one. She laughed a short, genuine laugh that he didn't often hear from her. The laugh of a person who operated in a maintained register of professional composure and occasionally let something reel through. Take care of yourself, Michael. I will. And Patricia. Yes. Thank you for everything you did, before, during all of it. A pause. That's what neighbors are for, she said. He hung up. Stood in the garage for a moment. The complaint would be handled. The police side was already being handled by people who knew what they were doing. The city council side had apparently handled itself because Richard Whitmore had underestimated the existing loyalty networks in a community he'd moved into 60 days ago. What remained was Richard himself. He called David Park. I need to know, Michael said, if there's a state-level housing authority or contract review board that covers the Atlanta metro area. David was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. There's a Georgia State Financing and Investment Commission that reviews contracts above a certain threshold. And the bid irregularities you found, would those be under their jurisdiction? Potentially, David said carefully. Michael, what are you thinking? I'm not thinking anything specific. I'm thinking that Richard Whitmore is about to use money and connections to make a false narrative about me into a legal problem. And I'm thinking that people who operate in the buffer zone between legal and illegal tend to have things that look different in the light. You want to put them in the light. I want to be ready to put them in the light, Michael said. If he makes this into something that requires it. David was quiet again. Longer this time. Michael, If I make a referral to the GSFIC not from you, just as a concerned citizen who's done some financial research, the investigation that follows is not going to be controllable. It has its own momentum. I know. And Richard Whitmore's company could be significantly damaged. I know that too. Another pause. Is that what you want? Michael thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. The question of what he wanted, which was different from the question of what the situation might require. He didn't want to destroy Richard Whitmore's company. He didn't want financial ruin for anyone. He wasn't angry enough for that, or rather, he was a different kind of man than the kind who converted anger into destruction, when there were people downstream of the destruction who hadn't chosen it. Not as a first move, he said. Hold it, but be ready. Understood. A pause. Michael, he's going to push on you, hard. Probably. You're sure you don't want to get ahead of it? I'm sure. He makes the next move. Then I respond to what he actually does, not what I think he might do. David was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it that Michael recognized as the particular kind of respect that only comes from people who understand what self-discipline actually costs. Okay, David said. I'll be ready. The next move came Wednesday morning, not from Richard's lawyer, not from the police department. It came in the form of a social media post on the Cedar Valley Community Facebook group, which had 1,100 members and was normally used for lost cat announcements and road closure updates and the occasional heated debate about the proposed changes to the Main Street parking situation. The post was from an account called Cedar Valley Truth, which had been created 2 days earlier, and it contained a video. The edited video. 15 seconds removed from the beginning. The version where Michael appeared to throw an unprovoked, unprepared young man to the ground. The post got 47 comments in the first hour. Michael found out about it at 8:15 when his phone buzzed with a text from Steve Alderman. You've seen the Facebook thing. He had not seen the Facebook thing. He looked at it now. Read the post carefully, the way he read everything for what was there and what was deliberately absent. Watched the video. Watched it again. Then he looked at the comments. The first 10 or 15 were the expected mix people who didn't know him, reacting to what they saw on the screen, which was a concerning image if you didn't have context. But the next wave was different. George Perkins. Mrs. Chen, and not Patricia, her sister, who lived 3 blocks away. Steve Alderman himself, who had posted a response that was 3 paragraphs long and included the phrase, I was standing 15 feet away for the entire incident, and what this video shows is not what happened. Tom Kerrigan had posted the full video, Mrs. Alderman's unedited recording, all 15 minutes, starting from the moment Brandon walked toward the craft table. By 10 in the morning, the Cedar Valley Truth account had been reported by enough members of the community group that the administrators had flagged it for review. By noon, Jim Paulson had been contacted by the group administrators to confirm the existence of an official police investigation, which apparently was enough for them to remove the post pending review. By 2 in the afternoon, Cedar Valley Truth had posted 3 more times each time, getting removed faster than the last. Michael watched this process from his kitchen with his phone on the table and a cup of coffee in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who is watching something resolve itself. He didn't post, he didn't comment, he didn't call anyone. He let the community handle it because the community was handling it, because that was what communities did when they were intact and healthy, and had been built over time by people who showed up for each other. He had been part of building this community for 3 years. 1 shovel at a time, 1 piano, 1 dropped drill bit, 1 cup of coffee with Tom on a slow morning, 1 casserole when someone's family had a loss. He had not been building towards this moment specifically. He had just been living here, being present, being the person he was. But it had added up. That was the thing Richard Whitmore couldn't buy and couldn't intimidate and couldn't edit out of a video. The fact that Michael Carter had been here and people knew him, and knowing him meant knowing that what they were being shown wasn't the whole truth. At 3:17, his phone rang. He looked at the number. Virginia area code. Didn't recognize it. He picked up. Mr. Carter. A man's voice. Precise, professional, with the measured cadence of someone who spoke carefully for a living. My name is Alan Drescher. I represent Richard Whitmore. Michael said nothing. I'm calling as a courtesy. Drescher continued to let you know that Mr. Whitmore intends to pursue a civil claim for the injuries his son sustained during the incident on Saturday. What injuries? Michael said. A brief pause. Mr. Brandon Whitmore experienced significant. What injuries specifically? Another pause. Drescher was recalibrating. People being this direct and this calm were not what attorneys calling with this kind of message expected. A bruised shoulder and, Brandon Whitmore attacked me at a public gathering in front of 60 witnesses, Michael said. He swung first. He swung multiple times. The full video of the entire incident unedited is currently available to view on the Cedar Valley Community Facebook page and has been submitted to the Cedar Valley Police Department. Your client's son also has 2 sealed juvenile arrest records in Georgia, at least one of which appears to be assault-related, which will be potentially discoverable if a civil suit is filed. I suggest you advise your client carefully before he decides how he wants to proceed. Silence. Real silence. The kind that meant someone on the other end of a phone call was doing a rapid, urgent recalculation. I see you've done your research, Drescher said finally. I always do my research. Mr. Carter. Tell Richard. Michael said that I have no interest in pursuing anything against him or his son. This is over if he wants it to be over. But if he makes it into something else, I'll be ready for whatever that something else is. Another silence. I'll convey your message. You do that. He hung up. He sat with the phone on the table and finished his coffee and thought about Richard Whitmore getting that message and what Richard Whitmore would do with it. He didn't have to wait long. At 6:40 that evening, Sophie called down from her room. Dad, there's a car outside. He went to the window. The dark gray car with the out-of-state plates, which he had thought was gone. It was parked across the street, 2 houses down. He watched it for 10 seconds. Nothing happened. He pulled on his jacket and went out the front door. He walked to the car calmly, directly, without hesitation. The driver's window was down. Inside was a man he hadn't seen before. 30s broad, the look of someone who was employed for situations that required presence rather than finesse. Can I help you? Michael said. The man looked at him. Something happened in his face, the recognition Michael thought of someone encountering an obstacle that is larger than it appeared from a distance. Just parked, the man said. Uh-huh. Michael looked at the plates, memorized them, looked back at the man. This is a residential street. The park's 2 blocks that way if you need somewhere to sit. A long beat. Right, the man said. He started the car. Michael stepped back. The car pulled away. He went inside, texted the plates to David Park with a single line, "This just showed up." Then he texted Tom Carr just left. Plates below. Let Jim know. Tom responded in 4 minutes on it. He went upstairs and knocked on Sophie's door. Hey. Hey. She was at her desk. Who was in the car? Nobody important. She turned around in her chair and looked at him with the full-faced directness of a person who was 15 and perceptive and had been watching her father navigate a situation for 3 weeks and was done being given partial information. Dad, she said, talk to me. He leaned against the doorframe, looked at her for a moment. Richard Whitmore hired someone to park outside our house, he said. He thinks it will make me nervous. Does it? No. Why not? Because men who are genuinely dangerous don't send someone to park on your street. Men who are genuinely dangerous are already moving. He paused. Richard Whitmore is a man who uses the appearance of threat to get what he wants. He's never needed to actually be threatening because the appearance has always worked. Sophie looked at him. And you're telling him it won't work. I'm telling him it won't work. She was quiet for a moment. Is this going to be over soon? Yes, he said. I think it is. And it was closer than he knew. David Park called at 9:45 that night. The plates, David said without greeting. The car is registered to a private investigation firm out of Charlotte, North Carolina, Becker and Associates. They do work for about a dozen clients in the Southeast. A pause. One of their regular clients is a corporate law firm in Atlanta. Whitmore's firm, Michael said. Whitmore's firm. Another pause waited. Michael, if Richard Whitmore hired a PI firm to surveil you, and that PI firm is affiliated with his attorneys, and this is now documented, because Jim Paulson apparently also ran those plates while Tom was texting me, then Richard Whitmore has a significantly larger problem than a neighborhood dispute. Michael was quiet. Using a private investigator to intimidate a witness or party to a legal dispute, David said carefully, could constitute witness tampering or harassment, depending on how his lawyers framed his instructions. The PI firm is going to want to distance themselves from this the moment they realize law enforcement ran their plates. You think they'll talk? I think private investigation firms that do legitimate work don't want their name attached to anything that looks like intimidation tactics in the context of a dispute where their client's son has a documented assault history and a pending police investigation. Michael sat with this. He had not gone after Richard Whitmore. He had simply been exactly where he was, which was a man in his house on his street who had done nothing wrong. And Richard, by sending a car to sit outside by using money and professional resources to try to apply pressure, had reached across the line into something that could not be walked back. Not by Michael. He hadn't done it. By himself. What happens now? He said. Probably nothing for a few days, David said. Then the PI firm calls Drescher. Drescher calls Richard, and Richard's lawyers tell him very clearly that he needs to stop. And if he doesn't, then a referral gets made, David said simply. And the GSFIC starts looking at Whitmore Construction's Atlanta Metro contracts. Michael was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Brandon quiet in the park, looking back over his shoulder. He thought about Richard Whitmore, who had built a life inside a buffer zone, and had never once been made to feel the thing that lived on the other side of it. He thought about whether consequence was the same thing as punishment, and decided that it was not necessarily that sometimes consequence was just the world correcting itself, restoring something that had gotten out of alignment. David, he said, hold on the referral. Still, I want to see if Richard can find his own way to this. A long pause. You're a more patient man than me. Different kind of training, Michael said. He ended the call, went to check the locks, not because he was afraid, but because checking the locks was something he did part of the routine, the ordinary maintenance of a life. Front door, back door, garage side entry. Then he went upstairs and stood outside Sophie's door and listened for the sound of her breathing, which was steady and even, which meant she was asleep. He went to his own room, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. I thought about something Ellen had said to him once early in their marriage, in the first year when he'd come back from a deployment and found the transition to ordinary life unexpectedly difficult, the way it sometimes was, the way the body and mind took time to recalibrate from high-stakes environments back to the pace and texture of a normal Tuesday. She'd said the hardest thing isn't fighting. It's knowing when you've already won. He hadn't fully understood it then. He understood it now. He'd won. Not at the barbecue, not with a physical demonstration that he'd never intended as the main event. He'd won the moment he'd walked back across the park to his daughter without a mark on him, without having harmed anyone seriously, without having become anything other than who he'd decided to be. Richard Whitmore was fighting a war that had already been decided. He just hadn't figured it out yet. The call from Drescher came Thursday at 10:14 in the morning. Mr. Carter, Drescher said, and the precise professional cadence was still there. But something under it had changed. A calibration adjustment. The register of a man who has received new information and is deciding how to deploy it. My client would like to discuss a resolution. What kind of resolution? A mutual, Drescher paused. A mutual agreement to consider the matter closed, with no further action from either party. Michael looked out the kitchen window at the Whitmore house. Is that what he wants? It's what I'm advising him to want, Mr. Carter. He could read the subtext perfectly. The PI firm had made the call he'd expected. Drescher had explained to Richard in the frank and urgent language of a lawyer advising a client against a course that was beginning to look expensive exactly what the exposure was. Then yes, Michael said. That works for me. Excellent. A barely audible exhale of relief. I'll draft a standard mutual release. No document, Michael said. His word that this is done. Delivered in person. A pause. In person. Yes. Mr. Carter, I don't need a lawyer's document. I need Richard Whitmore to stand in front of me and say he's done. A beat. That's not negotiable. Silence. Longer than the previous silences. Then, I'll convey that to my client. He hung up. He made another coffee, looked at his hands. Steady. Richard Whitmore knocked on his door at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He had come alone. No lawyer, no entourage, no son. Just a man in a blazer on a Thursday afternoon standing on the porch of the house next door. And the look on his face was something that Michael had seen before on men who had run out of buffer zone. It was not quite humility. Humility was something you arrived at from the inside. This was more like exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who had pushed in every direction and found that every direction pushed back. Michael opened the door. He didn't step back to let Richard in. They stood on the porch. "My lawyer tells me," Richard said, and his voice had the flatness of a man reading from a script he didn't write, but had accepted, "that I've handled this situation poorly." "Your son approached my daughter at her school," Michael said. Richard's jaw worked. "I know. At a public gathering in front of the whole neighborhood, he initiated a physical altercation." "I know. And then you tried to use money and legal threats and a private investigation firm to revise what happened into something else." Richard's eyes went somewhere complicated. He was a man who had built an identity around winning, around the ability to reshape situations through resources, and what he was experiencing right now was the specific vertigo of someone in freefall from a height they'd spent a long time building. "I want this done," Richard said. "Whatever this is, I want it done." Michael looked at him for a long moment. "Your son," he said. "Do you know what he said to me in the park after?" Richard's face shifted. He shook his head slightly. "He asked me who I was." Michael paused. "I told him I was Sophie's father. That's the only answer he needed." "And Richard." He used the man's first name deliberately, not as intimacy, but as clarity, as the plain address of one person to another, stripped of all the layers they'd accumulated. "Your son is 19 years old. He is not what you think he is. He's also not what he thinks he is. He's someone who got shaped by the wrong things and hasn't had anyone push back hard enough to show him the difference." Richard looked at him. Something was happening in his face that had nothing to do with the lawyers, or the narrative, or the power games. Something that lived underneath all of those. "He's a good kid," Richard said. The words came out quiet and slightly unsteady, the voice of a father rather than a businessman. "He could be," Michael said. "That's actually up to you more than it is up to him." A silence. "Are we done?" Richard said. "We're done," Michael said. "If you want to be done." Richard nodded. Once. It was a small movement for a large man trying to hold himself together. He walked back down the porch steps. He did not look back. Michael watched him go. He stood on the porch until Richard had crossed to his own property and the door had closed behind him. Then he stood for another moment in the cooling afternoon air, feeling the particular quality of something that had been held for a long time releasing its tension. Not victory. That word was too small and too sharp. Something quieter than that. Resolution. He went inside. The kitchen smelled like the coffee he'd made. His jacket was on the hook by the door. His daughter's shoes were by the stairs the way they always were, because she always forgot to put them in the closet, and he had stopped trying to change this, because some things were not battles, and some things were just your daughter's shoes by the stairs, and that was fine. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands. Steady. He thought about Ellen, who had asked him early in their marriage if he ever thought about what he was building, not as an operator, not as a professional, but as a person. What structure he was putting up that would still be standing when the operational life was done. He had not had a good answer then. He thought he had one now. It was this kitchen, this address, this block, these neighbors, this community that had known him for 3 years and had not hesitated when it counted. Tom Kerrigan and Jim Paulson and Patricia Chin and Steve Alderman and George Perkins and Mrs. Alderman, with her phone out for 15 unedited minutes. and Sophie's shoes by the stairs. That was what he'd built. That was what had held. He heard the front door open at 3:48. The familiar sound of a backpack hitting the floor. The refrigerator opening. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway with an apple, and her hair slightly wind-ruffled from the walk from the bus stop, and the expression of someone who had been thinking about something all day and was ready to talk about it. She looked at him, at his face. "It's over," she said, not a question. "Yeah," he said. "It's over." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she came to the table and sat down across from him the way she'd sat down across from him 1,000 times, the way she would sit down across from him, 10,000 times more if he was lucky, and bit into the apple and said, "Tell me." So he did. He told her everything. Not the version he would have told her 3 years ago when she was 12, and grieving, and the world had already asked too much of her. Not the edited version, the one with the rough edges, sanded down the stakes, lowered the weight distributed into something more manageable for a child. He told her the actual version. Because she wasn't 12 anymore, and because she had been there, and because she had earned the truth the way people earn things by showing up when it cost something. He told her about David Park and the research on Richard Whitmore. About the bid irregularities and the investigator who changed jobs and the buffer zone that Richard had constructed around his decisions. He told her about the PI firm and the car with the out-of-state plates that had sat outside their house and why it hadn't worried him the way Richard had intended it to. He told her about Drescher's call and what it meant, and why he'd asked for Richard to come in person rather than signing a document. Sophie listened, the way she always listened, still focused. The apple forgotten in her hand, her eyes on him with the particular quality of attention that her mother had called her superpower since she was 5 years old. The ability to hear not just what was being said, but what was underneath it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You knew all of this was going to happen," she said. "Before the barbecue." "Not specifically. I knew something was going to happen. And you let it." "Yeah." She turned the apple in her hand. "Because if you'd tried to stop it before it started, Richard would have framed you as the aggressor." He looked at her. "When did you get so good at this?" "I've been watching you for 15 years. A small pause. "And Mom used to say you thought 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room." He felt the familiar weight of it, not painful anymore, or not only painful, but present. Weight of someone being known by someone who was gone. The way the people who loved you continued to know you, even after they couldn't tell you about it anymore. "She was generous," he said. "She was accurate," Sophie said. "Big difference." He almost laughed. He actually almost laughed. "Yeah." She set the apple on the table. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "The thing in the park, with Brandon." She looked at him. "I saw it from the craft table. I saw all of it." A beat. "What you did, the way you moved, I've never seen anything like that. And I've seen a lot of videos of martial arts and fighting and things you know online, and none of it looks like that." She paused. "That wasn't just training, was it?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. "What was it?" He thought about how to say the true thing in the plainest possible way. "There are things you learn in training," he said. "Techniques, principles, the mechanics of how bodies work in a contest. That's one layer." He paused. "And then there's the layer underneath that which you don't get in a gym. You get it from being in situations where the mechanics have to actually work in the dark under pressure when there's no referee and no tap out, when the cost of a mistake is absolute." Another pause. "Brandon is good. He's genuinely good. What he doesn't have is that second layer because you can't manufacture it. You can only get it one way." Sophie was very quiet. "How many times did you almost—" She stopped, started again. "How close did it get in the things you did before?" He looked at his hands on the table. "Close enough," he said, "that every ordinary morning feels like something I earned." She was still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. She didn't say anything. She just left her hand there the way Ellen used to do, the particular eloquence of not needing words of presence, being the whole of the thing. They sat like that for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The light through the window had gone golden and long, the way October light did in the late afternoon, and somewhere outside a neighbor was raking leaves, the rhythmic scrape of it carrying through the walls of the house. Ordinary sounds. The sound of a life that had remained intact. That was the night Michael Carter decided it was time to tell Sophie more. Not everything. Some things were classified in the literal sense, bound by the obligations of service, in ways that didn't end when the service did. But more than she knew. More than he'd let her have access to. Because she was 15 and she trusted him, and trust deserved truth. And because the life he'd built here in Cedar Valley, the quiet life, the garden and the old Jeep and the Springsteen on the shop radio. That life was real, was genuinely what he wanted, but it existed on top of a foundation that she deserved to understand. Haimada dinner while he talked. Pasta from scratch the way he'd learned from a chef in New Orleans he'd met at a bar the week before, a deployment. A man who'd said that the best thing you could do for someone was feed them something that took time to make. He cooked and he talked, and Sophie sat at the kitchen table and listened, and the story came out in the plain, unadorned way that true things come out when you've been holding them long enough. He told her about buds, about the cold water and the sleep deprivation, and the particular crucible of a selection process designed not to find the strongest men, but to find the men who could still make good decisions when everything in their body was telling them to stop. He told her about the teams, not the operations specifically, not the classified details, but the culture of it. The brotherhood. The particular way of relating to other people that developed when you operated in conditions where the person next to you was the difference between coming home and not. He told her about some of the places he'd been, not what he'd done there. Just the places, the quality of different kinds of dark, the particular weight of different atmospheres. He told her about the thing that happened 18 months before he retired. Not a mission, something quieter. Something that happened in a briefing room where he was asked to evaluate a plan that he believed with complete professional certainty would get men he was responsible for killed. And the conversation that followed, which had been difficult and protracted, and which had ultimately resulted in the plan being revised, and no one dying who didn't have to die, and which had also quietly professionally, in the way that these things happened in organizational environments, made his continued advancement somewhat less likely than it had previously been. You did the right thing, Sophie said immediately. I think so. You know so. Yeah. He put the pasta in the water. But the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. And that was the moment I started to understand that the career had a shape that I hadn't fully seen before, and that the shape might not be what I wanted to build my whole life around. She was quiet. And then Mom got sick, she said softly. And then Mom. He turned from the stove briefly. And that clarified things. The way certain things do. The way you stop wondering about some questions because the answer becomes obvious. You chose us. I chose you. There was no choice really. You were the only option that made sense. She didn't say anything. She looked at the table. He finished the pasta. Grated cheese. Brought 2 bowls to the table and sat down across from her, and they ate in the comfortable silence that was the specific gift of people who had been through things together. After a while she said, "Do you miss it?" He thought about it honestly. "I miss some things," he said. "I miss the clarity. There's a particular kind of clarity in high-stakes situations. Everything irrelevant falls away, and what's left is just the problem, and your capability, and the people beside you. I miss that feeling." He twirled pasta on his fork. "I don't miss the cost. I don't miss what it required me to set aside to be good at it." "Like what?" "Like this," he said simply. "Like a Tuesday night making pasta and talking to you." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that was complicated and young and very true. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I know that's simple." "Simple is good," he said. "Simple is actually the hardest thing to get right." The week after Richard Whitmore's porch visit was quiet, in the way that Cedar Valley was quiet when nothing was wrong. The specific settled piece of a place going about its ordinary business without friction or crisis. Michael went to the hardware store, fixed the loose board on the back fence, had coffee with Tom Kerrigan on a slow Wednesday morning, and talked about Tom's daughter, who was thinking about law school, and Tom's back, which was giving him grief, and the plans for the community center renovation that Patricia Chen had been driving for 2 years. Normal. Completely normal. He noticed that he was grateful for it in a way that wasn't passive. Not the taken-for-granted gratitude of someone who has always had something, but the active, specific, earned gratitude of a person who knows exactly what the alternative looks like. Brandon Whitmore knocked on his door on a Thursday morning 11 days after the barbecue. Michael opened the door. They looked at each other. Brandon was alone. He was not in gym clothes or with any performance of toughness. He was wearing a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans, and he looked younger than 19, without the armor of the persona he'd been wearing since the day he moved in. He looked, Michael thought, like a kid who hadn't slept well. "I need to say something," Brandon said. Michael opened the door wider. "Come in." Brandon hesitated for a fraction of a second, genuinely surprised. Michael thought that the door was opening and then came inside. They stood in the kitchen, not sitting. Brandon looked at the table, at the walls, at everything except Michael, the way people did when they were trying to find a way into something they'd never said before. "I'm sorry," Brandon said. "For Sophie. For what I said to her." He stopped. "At school and before that, the things I said." He finally looked at Michael. "She didn't deserve any of it." Michael was quiet. "I know sorry doesn't..." Brandon stopped again. "I've been thinking about the park. About what happened." A long pause. "I've been fighting since I was 14. Regional titles. My coach said I was going to go somewhere with it." He looked at his hands. I've never..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "You've never lost," Michael said. Brandon looked up. "Not like that." Michael sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, Brandon sat across from him in Sophie's chair, the same chair where Sophie had put her hand on Michael's hand, in the golden afternoon light. "Can I ask you something?" Brandon said. "Go ahead." "What were you before?" He met Michael's eyes. "My dad said you were probably ex-military, some low-level whatever. But that's not..." He shook his head. "That's not what I was dealing with in that park." Michael looked at him. I thought about how much to say and why. He thought about the 19-year-old across from him who had knocked on the door alone, without his father, without his friends, without any of the props his identity normally required. He thought about what that had cost and what it might mean. "Navy SEAL," Michael said. 23 years. The last 10 as a team leader. The silence that followed was a particular kind. Brandon stared at him. "Team leader," he said finally. The words came out flat, processing. "Yes." Another silence. Brandon looked at the table. His jaw worked. When he looked up again, his face had done something, rearranged itself around the new information, the new frame, and what was looking back at Michael was not the 19-year-old who had sauntered across the park with his gym friends and his performance of invincibility. It was something younger and more honest than that. "And you're living here," Brandon said. "Fixing gutters." "Raising my daughter," Michael said. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. "My dad thinks money fixes everything," he said. It came out with a bitterness that surprised Michael, not directed at him, directed inward at something Brandon had been carrying longer than this situation. "He's been telling me since I was 10 that if you have enough money and you're the strongest person in the room, nothing can touch you." A pause. "He believed it. I believed it." He looked at Michael. "You had neither one, and I couldn't touch you." "It's not about strength," Michael said, "or money." "I know that now," Brandon said. And then quieter, "I should have known it before." There was something Michael wanted to say. Had been thinking about saying, or rather had been thinking around circling it, the way you circled something on a map, to understand its shape before you approached it. "You're 19, he said. "Yeah. You have the rest of your life to figure out what you're actually made of, what your strength is actually for." He paused. "In my experience, the people who figure that out earliest are the ones who hit something they can't overpower. Something that forces them to look for a different answer." Brandon looked at him. "Are you saying I should be grateful?" There was a flash of the old defensiveness in it, but dry, almost self-aware, the kind of defensiveness that knows what it is. I'm saying it's possible to be angry and also learn something, Michael said. Both things can be true. A long silence. My dad's hiring a new lawyer, Brandon said quietly. Tried to get me to... He stopped. I told him no. I told him this was done. Michael looked at him carefully. How did he take that? Not well. A small, complicated exhale. But I'm 19. He can't actually make me do anything. A pause. I think he's starting to figure that out. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Just the quiet shift of a situation finding its true level. Brandon, Michael said, the things you were told about strength, about money, about how the world works, you learned them from someone who was wrong. That's not an excuse for what you did, but it's context. He held the younger man's gaze. Context matters. What you do with it matters more. Brandon looked at him for a long moment. Is that Navy SEAL wisdom? He said. And there was something in it, some small tentative thing that wasn't mockery. That's just true, Michael said. Brandon nodded slowly. He pushed back from the table and stood. He was going to leave Michael, and some things were going to be different for him from here on, and some things would take time, and some things might not change at all, and that was the truth of it. You couldn't give someone the journey. You could only show them where the road was. Tell Sophie, Brandon started. Stopped. Tell her I know sorry's not enough, but I mean it. Tell her yourself, Michael said, when you see her. Brandon looked at him. She's 15, Michael said. She's going to live on this block for another 3 years, so will you. Things can be different than they were. He paused. If you want them to be. Another silence. Brandon nodded. He went to the door. He paused with his hand on it. One more thing, he said, not turning around. In the park, when you had me. He stopped. You didn't hit me, not once. Why? Michael was quiet for a moment. Because the goal was never to hurt you, he said. The goal was to stop something that needed to stop. Brandon stood there for a moment. Then he opened the door and left. Michael sat at the kitchen table. He heard the footsteps cross the porch and down the steps and across the yard. He heard distantly the Whitmore door open and close. He sat with the quiet. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore house went on the market. He found out from Patricia Chen, who had found out from a realtor she knew, who had said the listing was described internally as a motivated seller situation. Richard Whitmore had apparently decided that Cedar Valley did not offer the right environment for his family's growth, which was one way to describe what had happened, Michael thought, and not entirely inaccurate. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He didn't feel much of anything sharp or clean. What he felt was something more gradual, a kind of settled relief, the way you felt when a door that had been stuck finally closed properly. Not celebration, just rightness. He told Sophie over dinner. They're leaving, she said. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Brandon too. I assume so. She turned her fork in her pasta. I saw him last week, at the mailbox. He said sorry, actually said it looking at me. She paused. And then he asked me about the chemistry test I had, because he saw me stressed about it one time when I got home. Michael looked at her. What did you tell him? I said I'd done okay, which I had. She looked up. He said good, and that was it. A small pause. It was weird, but not bad weird. Yeah, Michael said. I think he might be okay, Sophie said. Eventually, maybe. Maybe, Michael said. You think so too, don't you? I think so too. She nodded, ate more pasta. Good. He got a call from David Park 6 days after the listing went up. I thought you should know, David said. The Georgia State Financing and Investment Commission opened a preliminary review of Whitmore construction last week. Not from me, apparently. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution did a piece on bid irregularities in city contracts, and one of their sources flagged the same patterns I found. Michael was quiet. I didn't make a referral, David said. I want to be clear about that. I know. Sunlight does its own work sometimes, David said, when the structure has those kinds of cracks. Yeah. A pause. How are you? Good, Michael said, and meant it. Sophie. She got an A on her chemistry test. Of course she did. A warmth in David's voice that had nothing to do with professional distance. She's going to run the world one day, Michael. I'm going to encourage her to run something slightly smaller, Michael said. For everyone's sake. David laughed. A real one. Good call. Take care of yourself. You too. He put the phone down and went outside. The garden needed work. It always needed work in October, the season that asked the most of you in terms of preparation for what was coming. The work you did now that paid out later in spring. The bulbs that went into the ground in faith that the cold months between would do what they needed to do and give you back something worth the wait. He got his tools and went to it. How was kneeling in the far bed, hands in the dirt, when he heard Sophie come out the side door. She stood on the porch for a moment watching him. You know what I figured out, she called. What? You do your best thinking in the garden. He considered this. That might be true. What are you thinking about right now? He paused with his hands in the soil. I was thinking about Ellen. About the particular way she had said his name on ordinary mornings. Not Michael, just the inflection of it. The homecoming sound of it. The sound that meant, you are known here, you are expected here, this is where you belong. He was thinking about 23 years of learning what strength was actually for, and the way it had taken him so long to understand that the answer was this. This garden, this block, this girl standing on the porch in the October light, asking him what he was thinking. I was thinking about Brandon Whitmore, who was somewhere in that house next door, packing boxes, carrying something different than what he'd arrived with. He hoped it was something useful. He hoped the crack in the shell let in more light than it let out warmth. I was thinking about the men he'd served with. The ones who came home, and the ones who didn't, and the ones who came home but left something behind. They never fully recovered, and the ones who found their way back to something ordinary and learned to love it the way you love something you almost lost. He was thinking that ordinary was the hardest thing to earn and the easiest to underestimate. He was thinking that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Come help, he said. I'll show you what goes in this bed. She made a face. I have homework. It'll take 20 minutes. That's what you said about the gutters. The gutters took 45 minutes, and this is different. He looked up at her. Come on, humor your old man. She came down the porch steps, making the face that meant she was pretending to be more reluctant than she actually was, and crouched down beside him in the dirt. He showed her where the bulbs went. She asked questions, the specific particular questions of a person who is actually interested rather than performing interest, and he answered them, and they worked together in the cooling afternoon, hands in the soil, while the street around them did what streets in small American towns did in October, which was go about its business with the specific, unhurried dignity of a place that knows what it is and doesn't need to prove it to anyone. When they were done, she stood and brushed the dirt from her knees and looked at the planted bed. We won't see anything until spring, she said. No, he said. That's the point. She looked at him. He looked at her. The light was long and golden, the way it always was this time of year, and she had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's eyes and her own particular way of standing, her own particular way of looking at things, clear and direct and without apology. That was entirely hers, built from everything she'd been and everywhere she'd been, and all the things she'd carried and set down and picked back up. Dad, she said. Yeah. I'm glad we live here. He looked at the house, at the garden, at the street beyond it, at the Whitmore house with its sales sign in the yard, at Cedar Valley, Virginia, which was 12,000 people, and a hardware store, and a diner, and a barbershop, and a small branch library, and neighbors who showed up when it counted. I thought about every choice that had brought him here, the long path through dark places and necessary things and personal costs that didn't show on the outside, and how all of it had been in service of something that was not large or famous or decorated. Just this, just ordinary, just exactly right. Me too, he said. He picked up his tools. The afternoon was still. The street was quiet. Somewhere inside the house his phone was probably buzzing with something that could wait. Everything that couldn't wait was already here. A man who could have chosen power chose peace instead. A man who was built for war chose to build something that could last. And a 15-year-old girl standing in a garden at the end of an October afternoon would grow up knowing exactly what strength was for not because anyone told her, but because she had watched her father live it one ordinary day at a time, until ordinary became the most extraordinary thing in the world. That was what he'd built, and it was enough. It was in every way that actually mattered more than enough.